There is a moment in history so strange, so unsettling, and so completely overlooked that most people have never heard a single word about it. A moment when one of the most powerful civilizations the world had ever seen simply packed up and walked away from an island it had occupied for nearly 4 centuries. No dramatic collapse, no final battle, just a slower, creeping withdrawal that left behind roads, ruins, and a population that had no idea what was coming next. And what came next was 400 years of darkness, so deep and so violent and so confusing that historians still argue about what actually happened. Cities emptied overnight, languages vanished, entire populations disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only buried bones and pottery shards and the faint outlines of walls that nobody bothered to maintain. This is one of those stories that falls through the cracks of the history books, buried somewhere between the glory of Rome and the familiar mythology of King Arthur. And tonight, we are going to walk straight into that gap and see what was actually waiting there in the dark. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Now, let us begin at the very beginning. Not the end of Rome in Britain, but the moment everything started to go wrong, which, as it turns out, happened long before the last Roman soldier stepped off the last ship and sailed back toward Gaul. The year is 367. Rome has been in Britain for over 300 years at this point. The island has been carved up, organized, administered, taxed, garrisoned, and in many ways thoroughly Romanized. There are cities with stone temples and public baths and proper sewers. There are roads so straight and so well built that some of them are still carrying traffic today, 2,000 years later. There is a wall in the north, a massive, extraordinary thing, built by the Emperor Hadrian himself, nearly 2.5 centuries earlier, stretching 73 miles from coast to coast, dotted with forts and mile castles and signal towers, manned by thousands of soldiers drawn from across the empire. Spain, Germany, Syria, North Africa. The Roman army in Britain is one of the most diverse military forces in the ancient world, and it has kept the island relatively stable for generations. And then, in 367, something happens that the Romans call the barbarian conspiracy, and it is a disaster so complete, so humiliating, so unexpected that it shakes the entire province to its foundations. Here is what makes the barbarian conspiracy so disturbing. It was not just an attack, it was coordinated. 3 separate groups that the Romans had been dealing with for years, groups that were supposed to be manageable threats, suddenly struck all at once. From the north came the Picts, the tattooed warriors from beyond Hadrian's wall, who had been a persistent irritant for generations, but had never quite managed to break through in any serious way. From the west came the Scotti, raiding parties from Ireland who had been probing the western coastlines for years. And from the south and east came a group the Romans called the Saxons, seaborne raiders from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, who had been attacking the coastal forts of the south in increasing numbers. All 3 of these groups struck at the same time. The Romans had not seen anything like this coming, or rather, the evidence suggests that they had seen it coming, in the sense that someone among the barbarians had clearly been doing reconnaissance, had clearly been gathering information about Roman dispositions, had clearly been communicating across distances that should have made communication impossible. And that is what really disturbed the Roman writers who recorded the event. Not just that the attack happened, but that it had been planned. That these groups, these supposedly savage peoples who were not supposed to have the organizational capacity for this kind of thing, had somehow managed to coordinate a simultaneous assault across hundreds of miles of sea and land. The Roman commander in Britain at the time, a man named Nectaridus, was killed early in the fighting. His replacement, another officer, appears to have lost control of the situation almost immediately. What followed was described by the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus in terms that read almost like a horror story. Soldiers deserted their posts. Scouts who had been sent to gather intelligence were captured or killed. Slaves and prisoners escaped and joined the raiders. The entire administrative structure of the northern part of the province simply ceased to function, and bands of armed men moved across the landscape, doing whatever they pleased, because there was no longer anyone with the authority or the means to stop them. The Emperor Valentinian, who was dealing with crises on multiple fronts simultaneously, eventually sent a general named Theodosius to restore order. And Theodosius did restore order, after a fashion. He drove the raiders back, he re-established the frontier, he patched the administrative apparatus back together, and he even built some new defensive installations. But here is the thing about the recovery from the barbarian conspiracy that never quite gets said clearly enough. The province of Britain after 367 was not the same as the province of Britain before 367. The seams were showing, the cracks in the foundation were visible to anyone who cared to look, and events were about to make those cracks very much worse. To understand what happens next, you need to understand something about the Roman Empire in the late 4th century. The empire was enormous. It stretched from Scotland in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the deserts of North Africa in the south, and it was being pressured from every direction simultaneously. The great migrations were beginning, the movements of peoples across the Eurasian steppe that would eventually transform the map of the entire world. The Huns had appeared somewhere east of the Caspian Sea and were driving everything before them westward. The Visigoths, a Germanic people who had been living in a kind of uneasy relationship with Rome for years, were desperate for sanctuary on the Roman side of the Danube. In 376, the Emperor Valens agreed to let them cross, and 2 years later, in 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, those same Visigoths killed Valens and destroyed a Roman army in one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. Britain is very far from Adrianople, but the ripples from that battle reached the island nonetheless, because the Roman Empire after Adrianople was an empire that had lost its sense of invincibility, and one of the consequences of that loss of confidence was a series of usurpations, of military commanders in the provinces declaring themselves emperor and marching their troops toward Rome to press their claims. Britain was not immune to this disease. In 383, a Spanish-born general named Magnus Maximus, who commanded troops in Britain, declared himself emperor and took a substantial portion of the British garrison with him when he crossed the Channel to fight for his claim. He was eventually defeated and executed in 388, but the troops he took with him largely never came back. The garrison of Britain had been thinned. It would be thinned again in 401, when the General Stilicho, who was effectively running the Western Empire at the time, withdrew more troops from Britain to deal with the crisis on the continent. And it would be thinned again, decisively, and perhaps finally, in 407. In 407, the situation in Britain had become chaotic in a very particular way. The remaining soldiers in the province, facing what they perceived as neglect and abandonment by the central government, elevated a series of their own commanders to the position of emperor in rapid succession. One was killed almost immediately by his own troops. A second met a similar fate, and then the soldiers elevated a third candidate, a common soldier, apparently, who had the very Roman name of Constantine. Constantine III, he called himself. And in 407, he crossed the Channel with what remained of the British garrison and marched into Gaul to press his claim. He was gone for years, and when the dust settled on the continent, Constantine III was dead, executed on the orders of the legitimate Emperor Honorius, and Britain was effectively on its own. There is a document, a letter that is cited again and again in histories of this period, and it is cited because it is one of the very few pieces of documentary evidence we have for what was happening in Britain in the years immediately after 407. The letter is addressed to the cities of Britain and is supposedly from the Emperor Honorius. And what the letter says, according to the historian Zosimus who recorded it, is that the cities should look to their own defense. Historians have debated this letter endlessly. Some think Zosimus made a mistake and that Honorius was actually writing to cities in a different province. The letter is just very brief. It tells the cities to defend themselves. And then, as far as official Roman correspondence with Britain is concerned, there is silence. Think about what that silence means for a moment. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had been a province of the Roman Empire. It had been taxed and administered and garrisoned and connected to a vast network of trade and communication and law that stretched across the known world. A person living in Roman Britain could travel to Rome, to Alexandria, to Antioch, to Constantinople, on roads maintained by the state, using a currency recognized everywhere, protected by laws enforced by the imperial apparatus. And then, in the space of a few years, that connection began to fray. And then it frayed more, and then, sometime in the first decade of the 5th century, it effectively snapped. But here is the thing that is easy to miss if you are not paying attention. The connection did not snap all at once, everywhere, simultaneously. It frayed differently in different places. And the story of the next 400 years in Britain is in large part the story of how different communities responded to that fraying in different ways. Let us talk about what Britain actually looked like in the years immediately after the Roman withdrawal, because the picture that emerges from the archaeological evidence is both more complicated and more interesting than the simple narrative of collapse that you might expect. In the south and east of the island, particularly in the areas that had been most thoroughly Romanized, there are signs of a rapid and quite dramatic collapse. The cities, the great Roman cities that had been the administrative and commercial centers of the province, cities like Londinium, which would eventually become London, and Eboracum, which would become York, and Corinium, which would become Cirencester. These cities experienced something in the early 5th century that archaeologists describe in terms that range from dramatic decline to something approaching sudden abandonment. The archaeological layers tell a story. In the late 4th century, you have buildings in use, coins circulating, pottery being bought and sold. And then there is a horizon, a layer in the soil, beyond which these things stop. The coin circulation drops dramatically or ceases entirely. The fine pottery that had been imported from the continent disappears. And in some cases, the buildings themselves begin to be abandoned or repurposed or simply left to fall down. This is not a slow decay. In some sites, the change happens fast enough that archaeologists can track it decade by decade. One generation, the forum is functioning. The next generation, it is not. But here is what complicates the simple collapse narrative. In the countryside, in the rural parts of Britain that had never been as deeply integrated into the Roman urban economy, the picture is different. Farms continue. Fields continue to be ploughed. People continue to live in buildings that look, on the outside, not very different from the buildings their grandparents had lived in. The collapse, in other words, is not uniform. It is patchy. It hits the elite structures of Roman society harder than it hits the ordinary lives of ordinary people. And this matters because it means that when we talk about what happened to the people of Britain after Rome, we are not talking about a single experience. We are talking about a fragmentation into dozens of different local experiences, shaped by geography, by local resources, by the presence or absence of strong leaders, by proximity to the coasts that the raiders were now targeting. Let us talk about those raiders, because the raiders are central to the story of post-Roman Britain, and they are often misunderstood. The Saxons. The word has become almost mythological in English language history. The Anglo-Saxons who gave their name to the language we are speaking right now, the people from whose word sinning we get the word king, from whose word ship we get the word ship. But who were the Saxons of the early 5th century? The ones who were raiding the coasts of Britain when Rome was still nominally in charge? They were people from the coastal regions of what is now northern Germany and Denmark, and they came to Britain initially not to settle, but to raid, to take things: cattle, slaves, silver, whatever could be carried back to the ships and transported home. They had been doing this for decades before the Roman withdrawal, and the Romans had actually built an entire system of coastal defences to deal with them. A string of massive forts along the eastern and southeastern coasts that archaeologists call the Saxon shore forts. These are extraordinary structures, some of them still partially standing today, with walls 3 meters thick and towers that could see for miles across the flat coastal plain. But the Saxon shore forts depended on garrisons, and the garrisons needed to be paid. And when the administrative connection to Rome frayed and then snapped, the mechanism for paying the garrisons broke down. We do not know exactly how or when. The evidence does not give us that level of precision. But what we can say is that by the second decade of the 5th century, the coordinated system of coastal defense that Rome had maintained in Britain was no longer functioning in any meaningful way, and into that gap came the raiders. Not all at once. Not in a great wave that washed away Roman Britain overnight, but steadily, persistently, incrementally, in small groups at first, landing on beaches, moving inland, sometimes fighting, sometimes finding that there was no one willing or able to fight them, taking what they wanted and going back to their ships. But some of them did not go back. Some of them looked at the land they had raided and saw something more than plunder. They saw land, and land in the world of the early 5th century was the thing worth having above all others. Now, here is where the story gets genuinely murky in a way that no historian has ever fully resolved. Because the question of how Britain went from being a Romanized province to being a collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms is one of the most contested questions in all of British history. And the reason it is so contested is that the evidence is so frustratingly incomplete. We have almost no written sources from Britain itself in the period between roughly 410 and 550. Almost nothing. The silence is extraordinary when you think about it. 4 centuries of Roman Britain had generated an enormous amount of documentary evidence. Tax records, official correspondence, military diplomas, inscriptions on stone, graffiti scratched into tiles before they dried. And then, in the early 5th century, that documentary record simply stops. There are a handful of British writers from this period, most notably a monk called Gildas, whose work we will get to. But for the most part, the literary record of Britain in the 5th century is a near total blank. What we have instead is archaeology. And archaeology is extraordinary in what it can tell you, and equally extraordinary in what it cannot. Archaeology can tell you where people lived and where they did not. It can tell you what they ate and what they traded and how they built their houses. It can tell you when a site was occupied and roughly when it was abandoned. What it cannot tell you, most of the time, is why. It cannot tell you what people were thinking. It cannot tell you what they were afraid of, or what they hoped for, or what stories they told each other around the fire. It cannot tell you whether the person who built that house spoke Latin or some ancestor of Welsh or a Germanic dialect that would eventually become Old English. And so we are left with this strange gap, this 400-year silence in the documentary record, filled in on one side by the stories the Romans told about Britain, and on the other side by the stories the Anglo-Saxons told about themselves, with almost nothing from the people who actually lived through the transition. Almost nothing, but not quite nothing, because there is Gildas. Gildas is one of the most important and most frustrating sources for the history of post-Roman Britain. He was a British monk writing in Latin, probably sometime in the mid-6th century, so roughly 100 years after the Roman withdrawal. His work, which is called De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, or On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, is not a history in any modern sense. It is a sermon. It is a furious, anguished, deeply passionate denunciation of the British kings and bishops of his day, whom he accuses of every imaginable sin and failure. And woven into this sermon, sometimes almost parenthetically, is a narrative of what had happened to Britain after Rome left. Gildas tells a story of catastrophe. He describes the Roman withdrawal. He describes the raids of the Picts and the Scots from the north and west. He describes how the Britons, overwhelmed and desperate, invited Germanic warriors to come and help defend them. He uses the Latin word foederati, which means federates or allies for these warriors, and he describes how those warriors turned on their employers, how they became the scourge rather than the defense of the island, burning and killing their way across the province, destroying cities and churches and all the works of civilization. It is a vivid and terrible account, and historians have spent 2 centuries arguing about how much of it is true. The problem is that Gildas is writing a century after the events he describes. He is writing as a moralist, not as a historian, and his purpose is to shame the rulers of his own day, not to provide an accurate record of the past. He exaggerates. He uses rhetorical flourishes that are clearly literary devices rather than literal descriptions. And he is maddeningly vague about dates and names and specific events. But here is the thing about Gildas that his critics sometimes miss. The overall shape of his narrative, the invitation of Germanic warriors, the rebellion of those warriors, the period of catastrophic violence. This matches, at least in broad outline, what the archaeology suggests. The burning horizons in some sites, the evidence of sudden abandonment in others, the pattern of change in material culture that tracks, roughly, with what we would expect if there had been a period of sustained violence and disruption. So Gildas is unreliable in his details and indispensable in his outline, which is, when you think about it, a perfectly appropriate state of affairs for the study of the post-Roman period in general. Unreliable in the details, indispensable in the outline. There is another source for this period, one that is even more controversial and even more fascinating than Gildas, and that is the Historia Britonum, or History of the Britons, attributed to a Welsh monk called Nennius and written sometime in the early 9th century. Nennius is writing more than 400 years after the events he describes, and he knows it. He even says so in a famous preface that is either admirably honest or deeply worrying, depending on your perspective. He says that he has made a heap of everything he could find. A heap. That is his word for his method. He gathered everything from everywhere and piled it together, and that, more or less, is the Historia Britonum. And in the middle of this heap, alongside king lists and genealogies and origin myths and geographical descriptions, there are 12 battles. 12 battles fought by a war leader named Ambrosius, or, in some versions of the text, a war leader named Arthur. Arthur. The name drops into history like a stone into a well, and the ripples have never stopped spreading. We are going to talk about Arthur. Not the Arthur of the Round Table, not the Arthur of Mallory and Tennyson and the movies, but the Arthur of the Historia Britonum. The Arthur who exists, if he exists at all, as a 5th century warlord fighting a series of battles against the Saxon invaders. The Arthur whose historical reality is one of the most debated questions in medieval scholarship. But before we get to Arthur, we need to spend some more time in the darkness of the early 5th century, because there is so much more happening there than the legend of Arthur can contain. Let us go back to the cities, because the fate of the Roman cities of Britain is one of the most extraordinary stories of the entire post-Roman period, and it is a story that is still being worked out by archaeologists right now. Take Londinium, Roman London. At its height in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Londinium was a city of perhaps 30 to 60,000 people, which made it one of the largest cities in the Roman West outside Italy. It had a forum, the largest in the northern provinces. It had an amphitheatre, it had public baths, it had a temple of Mithras, whose extraordinary remains you can still see today, relocated to a spot near where they were found. It had a great wall around it, most of which was built in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, and which formed the basis of the medieval walls of the City of London that were still standing in places into the 18th century. And then, in the early 5th century, Londinium went quiet. Not completely quiet, not immediately, but the signs of urban life, the coins, the fine pottery, the evidence of commercial activity, all of these things diminished dramatically in the early decades of the 5th century. Buildings are abandoned. Some of them collapse. Others are robbed for their stone and brick, which get reused elsewhere. The population shrinks, perhaps dramatically. We do not know where the people went. That is one of the great mysteries of the period. Some of them may have died in the famines and epidemics that always accompany the collapse of complex administrative systems. Some of them may have fled to the countryside, reverting to a more rural, subsistence-based way of life. Some of them, the wealthy, the well-connected, those with property and family connections on the continent, may simply have left. Gone to Gaul or further south, taking their movable wealth with them, and some of them, certainly, stayed. Londinium does not simply cease to exist in the 5th century. There is evidence of continued occupation, though at a much reduced level. But the nature of that occupation changes in ways that are difficult to interpret. The people who remain in Londinium in the mid-5th century are not living the same kind of life as the people who had lived there in the late 4th century. They are living in a different world. Now multiply this story across the dozens of Roman towns in Britain, each one with its own trajectory, its own particular combination of survival and decline, its own moments of catastrophe and moments of unexpected resilience. York in the north, which had been the base of the Roman military command in Britain, the city where the Emperor Constantius Chlorus had died in 306, where his son, Constantine the Great, had been proclaimed emperor by the troops. Cirencester in the west, which had been the capital of one of the 4 administrative regions of Roman Britain and one of the largest cities in the province. Winchester in the south, Colchester in the east, the oldest Roman town in Britain, the place where the first Roman colony had been established by the Emperor Claudius in the 1st century. St. Albans to the northwest of London, where there had been a major religious sanctuary. All of these places go through their own version of the same story, with variations in the 5th century. And the cumulative effect of these variations is the destruction of the urban network that had held Roman Britain together as a coherent civilization. Because this is the thing about Roman cities. They are not just places where people happen to live. They are nodes in a network. They are connected to each other and to the wider empire by roads and trade routes and administrative structures. Remove the administrative structures, interrupt the trade routes, and the nodes begin to malfunction. And when enough nodes malfunction, the network as a whole stops working. The whole becomes less than the sum of its parts. That is what happened to Roman Britain in the 5th century. The network failed. And without the network, the individual communities of Britain were on their own. And on their own, they responded in an enormous variety of ways. Some communities retreated to high ground, to hill forts that had been abandoned centuries earlier when Rome had imposed its order on the landscape. There is fascinating evidence from a number of sites in Western Britain. Hill forts that had been empty since the Iron Age, suddenly being reoccupied in the late 4th and 5th centuries. People going back to the old places, going back to the high ground that their distant ancestors had chosen for exactly the same reasons. For defensibility, for visibility, for the sense of security that comes from being able to see what is coming. Cadbury Castle in Somerset is one of the most famous of these reoccupied hill forts. It is a massive earthwork, originally built in the Iron Age, with multiple banks and ditches that still impress even 2,000 years later. And in the late 5th or early 6th century, someone built on top of it, someone who had resources. There is evidence of a great hall. There is evidence of imported Mediterranean pottery, the kind of pottery that in this period is associated with people of high status, people who were still plugged into the long-distance trade networks that connected the western fringes of Britain with the Mediterranean world, even as those networks were fraying elsewhere. There is evidence of metalworking, of feasting, of the material culture of a warlord, maintaining a household of retainers. And because Cadbury Castle is in Somerset, and because local tradition has associated it with the name Camelot since at least the 16th century, and because the dating of the high-status occupation of the site fits perfectly with the period in which an historical Arthur might have lived, the site has attracted enormous attention. Whether that attention is justified, whether Cadbury Castle really was Camelot, whether Camelot really existed, whether Arthur really existed, all of these questions remain open. But what is not in question is that someone was at Cadbury Castle in the late 5th or early 6th century. Someone with power and resources and connections. Someone who was living in a way that was not entirely unlike the way a late Roman military commander might have lived. And that someone, whoever they were, is part of the story of post-Roman Britain. Part of the story of how order was maintained, or attempted, in a world where the old order had broken down. Let us talk about the western edges of Britain, because the story there is quite different from the story in the south and east, and in ways that have enormous consequences for the eventual shape of the British Isles. In Wales, in Cornwall, in the southwest peninsula, in the areas of Britain that would eventually become what we now call the Celtic fringe, the Roman withdrawal played out very differently. These areas had always been less thoroughly Romanized than the south and east. The military presence had been stronger than the civilian presence. There were forts and roads, but fewer of the great urban centers that dominated the southern lowlands. And as a result, when the Roman administrative apparatus collapsed, there was less to collapse. What remained, what had always been there, underneath the Roman overlay, was a society organized around kinship groups and local chieftains, speaking a language that would eventually become Welsh and Cornish and Breton. These people, the Brittonic-speaking inhabitants of Western Britain, did not experience the 5th century as the total rupture that the inhabitants of the lowland towns experienced. They experienced it more as a gradual loosening, a slow shift of authority from Roman-appointed officials to local strong men, from the language of administration to the language of the hearth. And in this process, something remarkable happened. The Brittonic language and the culture associated with it survived. Not everywhere. In the east and south, where the Anglo-Saxon settlement was heaviest, it was eventually extinguished, replaced by the language of the newcomers. But in the west, it survived, transformed by centuries of change, but recognizably continuous with what had been spoken in those hills before Rome ever arrived. This matters enormously, because the survival of the Brittonic language and culture in the West is the foundation of the Welsh national identity, and ultimately of the idea of Britain itself as something distinct from England. The very word British comes from the Brittonic people, the Britons, and the story of how they survived the collapse of Rome and maintained their identity through 4 centuries of chaos is one of the great stories of resilience in human history, even if it is one that very few people know. But it is not a simple story of heroic resistance. It is complicated by all kinds of internal tensions, by competition among local rulers, by the pressures of the Irish raiders from the west and the Picts from the north, by epidemics and famines, and the simple, grinding difficulty of maintaining civilization when the institutions that had supported civilization were gone. Speaking of the Irish, because the Irish are a crucial and often underappreciated part of the story of post-Roman Britain, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Irish raiders, whom the Romans called the Scotti, had been a persistent problem along the western coasts of Britain. They raided for slaves and cattle and portable wealth, just as the Saxons raided the eastern coasts. And like the Saxons, some of them eventually stopped raiding and started settling. There is evidence of Irish settlement in parts of Wales, in Cornwall, and most significantly in southwestern Scotland and the area that is now known as Argyll in the late 4th and 5th centuries. And one of the consequences of this Irish settlement in southwestern Scotland was the kingdom of Dalriata, a kingdom that straddled the sea between northeastern Ireland and southwestern Scotland, and that would eventually play a crucial role in the formation of the Kingdom of Scotland. But the most famous story connected to the Irish raids on Britain in this period is not a political one. It is a personal one. It is the story of a young man, probably the son of a minor Romano-British official, who was taken from his home in Western Britain by Irish raiders sometime in the early 5th century and sold into slavery in Ireland. He spent years as a slave there, tending animals on a hill, cold and hungry and far from everything he had known. And then he escaped. He made his way back to Britain. He was educated, ordained as a Christian priest, and eventually, driven by what he experienced as a divine calling, he went back to Ireland. Not as a slave or a raider, but as a missionary. His name was Patrick. And the story of how he converted Ireland to Christianity is one of the great pivots in Western history, one that would have consequences that neither Patrick nor anyone else could have imagined. Because what happened in Ireland after Patrick is extraordinary. Ireland had never been part of the Roman Empire. It had never been Christianized. And then, in the space of a century or so, it became not just Christian, but intensely, enthusiastically, intellectually Christian. Irish monasteries became centers of learning at precisely the moment when the rest of the former Roman West was experiencing its darkest hours. While the continental monasteries were struggling to maintain their libraries and their scriptoriums in the face of the ongoing upheaval, Irish monks were copying manuscripts and composing poetry and developing theological arguments and producing illuminated gospels of heartbreaking beauty. And then they sent those monks back out into the world. Irish missionaries travelled across Scotland, across northern England, across the continent of Europe. They founded monasteries and schools. They preserved texts and transmitted knowledge. They were, in a very real sense, the people who kept the lights on in Western civilization during the darkest years of the early medieval period. And it all began with a Romano-British slave boy who refused to stay lost. Let us go back to Britain itself and track what is happening there in the mid-5th century, because we have been circling around the central catastrophe, and it is time to look at it directly. In his account of the events of this period, Gildas describes a moment of terrible decision. The Britons, overwhelmed by the raids from the north, from the Picts and the Scots, decide to invite Germanic warriors to come and help them defend the island. Gildas uses the term superbus tyrannus, the proud tyrant for the British ruler who makes this decision. A later tradition names this ruler Vortigern, and the warriors he invites are the leaders of Saxon warbands, men who in later tradition are given the names Hengist and Horsa. This story, the invitation of the Saxons, has been told and retold so many times that it has become almost mythological. The proud British king who made the fatal mistake of inviting the wolves into the fold. The treacherous Saxon brothers who smiled and agreed to serve and then turned on their masters. It is a story about betrayal, about the dangerous naivety of those who trust too easily, and about the consequences of that naivety for a whole civilization. But here is what makes it historically interesting, rather than just dramatically satisfying. The practice of inviting Germanic warriors to serve as foederati, as federate allies, was not unusual in the late Roman period. The Romans had been doing it for centuries. They had been hiring Germanic warriors and settled Germanic communities to serve in the Roman military for generations. Sometimes this worked well, sometimes it ended in disaster, but it was an established practice, something that made sense within the framework of late Roman military policy. What Vortigern, or whoever made the decision, was doing was essentially trying to apply late Roman solutions to a post-Roman problem. The problem was that the post-Roman situation in Britain did not have the institutional framework that had made the federate system work when Rome was in charge. There was no longer a central government to enforce contracts. There was no longer a reliable mechanism for paying the federates the land or the goods that had been promised to them. And when the federates decided they were not getting what they had been promised, there was no longer an imperial army to discipline them. So the revolt happened. In Gildas's telling, it is total and catastrophic. The Saxons spread across the island, burning and killing. Cities are destroyed, churches are burned. People flee to the hills or across the sea, to Brittany, the northwestern peninsula of Gaul that takes its name from the British refugees who settled there in large numbers during this period. The island is devastated. This is the picture Gildas paints. And as I said earlier, archaeologists debate how literally to take it. The evidence for widespread burning and destruction in the mid-5th century is real in some areas, but it is not universal. The collapse was not uniform, but something happened, something significant and violent enough to register in the material record. And then, somewhere in the second half of the 5th century, perhaps in the 460s or 470s or 480s, the tide turned. Or so the sources suggest. Gildas mentions a siege of a place called Mons Badonicus, Mount Badon, as the great victory of the Britons over the Saxons. He says it was the year of his birth, which would place it sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century. He says it was the most recent great calamity of the enemy. He implies that after this battle, there was a period of relative peace, and he attributes this victory, or at least the period that preceded it, to a leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus. Ambrosius Aurelianus. He appears in the pages of Gildas, almost as a figure from another world. Gildas says his parents had worn the purple, meaning they were of Roman imperial stock, which would make Ambrosius either a descendant of one of the emperors, or at least someone from a family that had held very high Roman office. He describes Ambrosius as a man of good character, modest in all things, who rallied the remnant of the Britons and began to fight back against the Saxons. In the Historia Britonum, the figure of Ambrosius is somewhat displaced by the figure of Arthur. The 12 battles that Nennius ascribes to Arthur are victories against the Saxons, and the last of them, the 12th, is the Battle of Baden Hill. Whether Ambrosius and Arthur are the same person or different people, or whether either of them is a real historical individual rather than a legendary construct around whom real memories of resistance have crystallized, is a question that has kept scholars arguing for centuries and will probably continue to do so for centuries more. What we can say with some confidence is this. Something happened in Britain in the late 5th century that halted the Anglo-Saxon advance for a generation or more. The archaeological evidence shows that the westward expansion of Anglo-Saxon material culture, which had been moving steadily inland from the eastern coasts since the mid-5th century, slows down and in some areas actually reverses in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. There is a pause, a breathing space. Whether that pause was the result of a great military victory, or of a series of smaller conflicts, or simply of the natural rhythms of migration and settlement, is something we cannot say with certainty. But during that pause, something was kept alive in Western Britain. The tradition of Brittonic culture and governance. The idea, however battered and diminished, that there was something called Britain, something worth defending. The memory of Rome, not as a living reality, but as an aspiration, a standard against which the chaos of the present could be measured and found wanting. And it is in this context, In this pause between the catastrophe of the mid-5th century and the resumption of Anglo-Saxon expansion in the late 6th century, that the legend of Arthur took shape. The legend of Arthur is not about the past, it is about the present. It is about what the Britons needed to believe about their past in order to face their present and their future. They needed to believe that there had been a great king, a golden age, a moment when Britain had been united under a just and powerful leader who had beaten back the Saxon threat. They needed to believe that the chaos of the current moment was not the natural state of things, that it was a temporary aberration, that what had been built once could be built again. Whether or not there was a real Arthur, the legend of Arthur served a real and important function. It kept alive the idea of a British identity at precisely the moment when that identity was under the most severe pressure it had ever faced. And that function did not end when the Anglo-Saxons eventually completed their conquest of most of the island. The legend of Arthur travelled west, into Wales and Cornwall, where the Brittonic-speaking people who retained their own identity and their own languages kept the story alive and transformed it, and elaborated it into something that eventually spread back across the whole of Europe, becoming one of the most powerful and enduring myths of Western civilization. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to stay in the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries a little longer, because there is so much more to explore there. Let us talk about religion, because the religious transformation of Britain in this period is one of the most dramatic and least discussed aspects of the entire story. Roman Britain had been a Christian province. The Emperor Constantine's conversion in 312 had eventually resulted in Christianity becoming the official religion of the empire, and by the late 4th century, Christianity was well established in Britain's cities and among the educated classes, even if pagan practices persisted in the countryside. There were British bishops who attended the great church councils of the 4th century. There was a British heresy, Pelagianism, named after a British monk named Pelagius, who developed a theology of free will that the rest of the church found distinctly unsatisfactory. There were Christian martyrs, most famously Saint Alban, who was executed at the Roman city of Verulamium, which would eventually be renamed after him in the 3rd century. And then the Anglo-Saxons arrived, and the Anglo-Saxons were not Christian. They were Germanic pagans, worshipping gods whose names we still carry in our days of the week. Tuesday, the god of law and justice. Wednesday, Woden's day, the chief of the gods. Thursday, Thuna's day, or Thor's day, the god of thunder. Friday, Frigg's day, the goddess of love and marriage. The arrival of Anglo-Saxon paganism in what had been a Christian province created a religious landscape of extraordinary complexity. In the East, in the areas of heaviest Anglo-Saxon settlement, Christianity was largely extinguished, at least for a generation or two. The churches were destroyed or repurposed. The bishops and priests fled or were killed. The Christian community either assimilated into the pagan Anglo-Saxon culture or retreated westward with the rest of the Britons. In the West, Christianity survived, and in the West it took on forms that were somewhat different from the forms it was taking on the continent, where the Pope in Rome was gradually establishing his authority over the Western Church. The Christianity of the Britons and the Irish had its own traditions, its own ways of calculating the date of Easter, its own style of monastic life, its own particular flavour of scholarship and spirituality. The monks of the Celtic Church, as historians sometimes call it, were in many ways the most intense and most creative Christians of the early medieval period. They went to extraordinary lengths in their pursuit of God. They fasted until they were emaciated. They sat in cold water, reciting psalms. They sailed off into the Atlantic in tiny boats, looking for islands where they could be alone with God, without any of the distractions of civilization. One of them, a man named Brendan, from what is now County Kerry in Ireland, reportedly sailed so far west that he reached lands beyond the horizon. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the Voyage of St. Brendan, is one of the great adventure stories of the early medieval period, and it has generated endless speculation about whether Brendan actually reached Iceland or the Faroe Islands or even North America, more than 500 years before the Vikings. We will never know for certain. But the fact that these monks were sailing into the unknown, that they were pushing the boundaries of the known world in pursuit of their spiritual quest, tells you something important about the nature of the Christianity that survived in the Celtic West. Meanwhile, in the Anglo-Saxon East, something was slowly changing. The process began in 597, when a monk named Augustine, not the great theologian Augustine of Hippo, but a different Augustine, arrived in Kent with a mission from Pope Gregory the Great to convert the English. The King of Kent, a man named Ethelbert, had a Frankish Christian wife, Bertha, who had been maintaining a small Christian chapel in Canterbury. Ethelbert allowed Augustine to preach. He was eventually baptized, and the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons began. It was not a quick process. It was not a smooth process. There were reversals and setbacks and moments when the whole thing seemed about to collapse. But gradually, over the course of the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms converted to Christianity. And when they did, the stage was set for one of the most interesting and productive culture clashes in British history. Because now you had two kinds of Christianity operating in Britain. The Roman Christianity that Augustine and his successors brought from the continent, organized around bishops in the Roman mold, acknowledging the authority of the Pope, and the Celtic Christianity of the Britons and the Irish, equally fervent but differently organized, with different traditions and different calendars. And when these two versions of Christianity encountered each other in Northumbria, in the north of England, in the mid-7th century, the result was a theological controversy of remarkable heat, centered on the apparently mundane question of how to calculate the date of Easter, but really about much deeper questions of authority and identity and the relationship between local tradition and universal church. The controversy was resolved in favor of Roman practice at the Synod of Whitby in 664. But the resolution did not erase the Celtic tradition. It simply pushed it to the margins. And from those margins, it continued to influence British and Irish Christianity for centuries. All of this is happening simultaneously with the political story of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which is itself extraordinarily complex. Because the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain did not produce a single unified Anglo-Saxon England. It produced a collection of small kingdoms, sometimes at war with each other, sometimes allied, constantly jockeying for position and advantage in a landscape that was being settled and farmed and fought over simultaneously. In the north, there were the kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira, which eventually merged to form Northumbria. In the east, there was East Anglia. In the East Midlands, there was Mercia, which would eventually become the dominant power in the Midlands and north for much of the 7th and 8th centuries. In the southeast, there was Kent and Sussex and Essex. In the south, there was Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, which would eventually, many centuries later, become the kingdom from which England emerged. These kingdoms fought each other constantly. They formed alliances and broke them. They converted to Christianity and sometimes relapsed into paganism. They produced kings of great ambition and kings of spectacular incompetence. They were, in other words, exactly what you would expect from a landscape that had been settled by competing warrior groups who had brought their own traditions of governance and their own ambitions with them from the continent. But they were not simply primitive warlords presiding over chaos. They were also creating something new. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms developed their own legal codes, their own administrative practices, their own literary traditions. Old English, the ancestor of the language we are speaking now, was being written down and used for administrative purposes, centuries before most European vernacular languages were committed to writing. The Anglo-Saxons had a rich tradition of oral poetry that they eventually wrote down, of which Beowulf is the most famous surviving example, but by no means the only one. And they were building, not in the Roman way, not in stone, mostly. The great Anglo-Saxon buildings were in wood, which is why so little of them survives. But they built great halls and churches, and gradually, as the decades passed and the memories of the chaos of the 5th century faded into legend, they built something that resembled stability. Meanwhile, in the West, the Brittonic kingdoms were going through their own processes of formation and dissolution and reformation. There were kingdoms in Wales, in Cornwall, in southwestern Scotland, in the area around what is now Glasgow and Dumbarton. Some of these kingdoms were strong enough to hold off the Anglo-Saxon advance for centuries. Wales, in particular, never fell to the Anglo-Saxons. It maintained its independence, fragmented among competing rulers, but recognizably Welsh in language and culture, until the late 13th century, when Edward I of England finally completed the conquest that the Anglo-Saxons had never managed. And in this period, in the 6th and 7th centuries, in these Brittonic kingdoms of the West, something extraordinary was happening in the realm of culture and language. The Welsh language, which descends directly from the Brittonic language spoken in Roman Britain, was producing poetry. Real poetry, serious poetry, poetry of great sophistication and beauty. The earliest poems in Welsh that survive date to around the 6th century, and they are the work of poets who were clearly heirs to a long tradition of court poetry, of the kind of poetic practice that had been associated with the bards of the Iron Age and had survived the Roman period and was now flourishing in the post-Roman kingdoms of the West. Two poets, Taliesin and Aneirin, are associated with this early period of Welsh poetry. Taliesin sang the praises of kings in northern Britain, in the region around what is now Edinburgh and the Scottish borders. Aneirin composed a poem called Gododin, which commemorates a disastrous raid by warriors of the Gododin people from the same northern region against the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Deira around the year 600. The warriors rode south to attack the Anglo-Saxon stronghold of Cattraeth, thought to be modern Catterick in Yorkshire. They were heavily outnumbered. They were killed almost to a man, and Aneirin, one of the few survivors, wrote a poem about them that is one of the oldest and most powerful elegies in any European language. Gododin contains, in one of its stanzas, a reference to a warrior who fought at Cattraeth. The warrior is praised for his bravery, and the poet says that he was not Arthur. He uses Arthur as a standard of comparison, a byword for heroic excellence. This is the earliest surviving reference to Arthur in any Welsh text, and what makes it so interesting is that it is not a story about Arthur, it is a casual reference. Arthur is mentioned as someone the audience already knows about. He does not need to be introduced or explained. He is already legendary. That tells us something. It tells us that by around 600, the legend of Arthur was already well established in the Brittonic world, already a shared reference point, already the kind of thing a poet could drop into a verse without explanation. Whatever the historical reality behind the legend, whatever kernel of truth or historical memory it contained, by the early 7th century, it had already crystallized into something that functioned as myth. We are now roughly 200 years into the 400 years of chaos that the title of this video promised you, and we have covered a great deal of ground, but there is more, much more. Because the story of post-Roman Britain does not end with the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the east and the Brittonic kingdoms in the west. It is about to be complicated by a new set of arrivals, new pressures, new catastrophes, and new resiliences. But before we get there, let us pause and think about what this story means for the people who lived through it. Think about what it would have been like to be born in Roman Britain, to grow up in a world that had roads and cities and coins and laws and the whole apparatus of a complex civilization. To speak Latin as a language of administration and culture, alongside whatever local language your family spoke at home. To be connected, however loosely and indirectly, to a world that stretched from Scotland to Syria. And then to watch all of that begin to fray. It would not have felt like a single dramatic collapse. It would have felt like a series of small changes, each individually manageable, collectively catastrophic. The roads get repaired less often, so you use them less. The market in town becomes less reliable, so you buy less and make more for yourself. The coins become scarcer, so you barter more. The soldiers at the fort become fewer, so you feel a little less safe, and then a little less safe again. And then one night the horizon is orange with fire, and you need to decide very quickly whether to run or to hide or to fight. And the decisions you make in those moments, the decisions your parents made and their parents before them, those decisions determine everything that comes after. Whether your children grow up speaking Latin or Brittonic or Old English or some mixture of all three, whether they grow up knowing what a Roman city looks like, or whether they grow up in a world where the stone buildings of the Romans are strange ruins full of unknown dangers, whether they grow up with a sense of connection to the wider world, or with an understanding that the world beyond the next valley is, for all practical purposes, beyond reach. The people of post-Roman Britain did not know they were living in a dark age. They did not know that historians 2,000 years later would describe their period as one of collapse and chaos. They were just living their lives, making their decisions, coping with the circumstances they found themselves in. Some of them coped brilliantly, some of them failed catastrophically. Most of them, as most people in most times and places, muddled through somewhere in between. And the world they made out of the ruins of Rome and the traditions of their ancestors and the pressures of the new arrivals from the East is the world that eventually became Britain. Not the Britain of today, exactly. Not yet. But something that would, over centuries, grow and transform and eventually emerge into something recognizable. Let us go north. Let us go to the part of Britain that was always the most complicated, the most contested, the most violent corner of the province. The borderlands. The territory beyond Hadrian's Wall. The Roman frontier in the north of Britain was not a single fixed line. It was more like a zone, a region of contested and complicated interaction between the Roman military on one side and a series of tribal peoples on the other. Hadrian's Wall was the most permanent and most famous expression of that frontier, but it was not always the northern limit of Roman influence. Sometimes the Romans pushed further north, building a second wall, the Antonine Wall, between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde, and garrisoning it for periods before eventually pulling back. And sometimes they tried to manage the peoples north of the wall through diplomacy and subsidy rather than military force, paying the tribal leaders to maintain peace and to act as a buffer between the Roman province and the peoples further north. This system of client kingdoms and subsidized tribal leaders in the borderlands had worked, more or less, for much of the Roman period. But like everything else in the late Roman period, it depended on the administrative and financial capacity of the empire. When that capacity began to fail, when the payments stopped and the garrisons thinned, the system broke down. And the peoples of the borderlands, who had been managing a complicated relationship with Rome for generations, suddenly found themselves in a world without that relationship, without the subsidies, without the threat of Roman military intervention, without the trade connections that had brought Roman goods into their communities, without, in other words, the context that had shaped their political and social life for centuries. The peoples who emerge into the historical record in this period as the inheritors of the borderlands are the Britons of the north, the people who spoke a form of the Brittonic language and who organized themselves into a series of small kingdoms in what is now southern Scotland and northern England. These kingdoms have names that echo through the early Welsh sources: Rheged, Gododin, Strathclyde, Elmet. They were real political entities with real rulers and real poets to sing their praises, and they were under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. From the north came the Picts. The Picts are one of the great enigmas of early medieval history. They appear in the Roman sources as the barbarians beyond the wall, the tattooed warriors who raided the province whenever the opportunity arose. They are described as particularly ferocious, particularly difficult to deal with. And then, after the Roman period, they appear in the Irish and Welsh sources as a significant power in what is now Scotland, a people with their own language, their own symbols carved on standing stones across the northeast of Scotland, and their own sophisticated culture that we are only beginning to understand. The Pictish symbol stones are extraordinary things, slabs of dressed stone, often quite large, carved with a complex system of symbols, animals, abstract designs, scenes of hunting and feasting and battle. The symbols are consistent enough, appearing in the same combinations across a wide geographic area, that scholars have long suspected they encode some kind of meaning, some system of communication or record keeping. Whether they represent names, genealogies, territorial claims, religious symbols, or something else entirely is still debated. The Picts did not leave a written literature in their own language. Whatever documents they may have created have not survived. So we see their monuments and their symbols without being able to fully read what those symbols say. What we do know is that the Picts were a significant military and political force in northern Britain in the post-Roman period. They defeated Roman expeditions sent against them. They raided deep into the territory of the Brittonic kingdoms, and they eventually, in the 9th century, merged with the kingdom of Dalriata to form what would eventually become the Kingdom of Scotland. But in the 5th and 6th centuries, they are a threat, a serious, persistent threat that occupies the attention and resources of the Brittonic kingdoms of the north and forces those kingdoms into a constant defensive posture that drains their energy and leaves them vulnerable on other fronts. From the south came the Anglo-Saxons. The Kingdom of Northumbria, the great northern Anglo-Saxon kingdom, expanded northward through the 6th and 7th centuries, absorbing territory that had previously been held by the Brittonic kingdoms. Elmet, the Brittonic kingdom centred in the area around what is now Leeds, was conquered by Northumbria in the early 7th century. Reged, the kingdom that some scholars associate with the poet Taliesin's patrons, faded from the historical record around the same time, perhaps absorbed by Northumbria through marriage alliance rather than conquest. The Gododin attempted their famous raid south and were annihilated. One by one, the Brittonic kingdoms of the north shrank or disappeared. The one exception was Strathclyde. The kingdom centred on the great rock of Dumbarton on the Firth of Clyde. Strathclyde survived. It maintained its identity as a Brittonic kingdom through the 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th centuries, a remarkable feat of political and military endurance in a landscape of constant pressure and change. It eventually merged with the emerging Kingdom of Scotland in the early 11th century, but by that point it had preserved a Brittonic identity for 600 years after the Roman withdrawal. 600 years. That is a story that deserves to be told more often. Now let us turn to something that is happening in the south of England in the late 6th and early 7th centuries that will eventually transform the entire island, the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. I mentioned Augustine's mission earlier, but the story of the conversion is more complex and more interesting than simply saying, the Pope sent missionaries and the pagans converted. The conversion of each Anglo-Saxon kingdom was a political event as much as a religious one. Kings converted when it was advantageous to do so, when the political and diplomatic benefits of aligning with Rome outweighed the costs of abandoning the old religion. They sometimes reverted to paganism when the political winds changed. They hedged their bets, maintaining both Christian and pagan shrines simultaneously, allowing Christian priests to operate while continuing to perform traditional pagan rituals. The famous story of the Northumbrian king Edwin's conversion, as told by the historian Bede, writing in the early 8th century, gives a flavour of this complexity. Edwin called a council of his advisers to discuss whether to accept Christianity. One of his high priests spoke in favour, but then an anonymous thane spoke up, and what he said has become one of the most famous passages in all of early medieval history. He compared human life to the flight of a sparrow through a warm hall on a winter's night. The sparrow comes in through one door, passes through the warmth and light of the hall, and then disappears out through another door into the cold and dark on the other side. "We can see the sparrow while it is in the hall," the thane said, "but we do not know where it came from or where it is going. Our life is like that. We know the time we spend in this world, but the time before our birth and the time after our death are hidden from us. If the Christian teaching has anything more certain to say about these things," he said, "then it deserves to be followed. It is a beautiful passage. It captures something true about the human condition. And it is, in some ways, a testament to the sophistication of the Anglo-Saxon culture that could produce a moment like this, a public philosophical debate about the nature of existence and the claims of competing religious traditions. Edwin converted. He was baptized at York in 627, and with his conversion, Northumbria became Christian. Although after his death in battle in 633, there was a pagan reaction that temporarily reversed the conversion before it was completed under his successors. The conversion of Northumbria is particularly significant because it is in Northumbria, in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, that one of the most remarkable cultural flowerings of the early medieval period takes place. The Northumbrian Renaissance, some historians call it, though that might be overstating things slightly. But the monasteries of Northumbria in this period, places like Lindisfarne and Wearmouth Jarrow, were centres of extraordinary intellectual and artistic activity. Lindisfarne, the island monastery founded by the Irish monk Aidan in 635, produced one of the greatest treasures of early medieval art, the Lindisfarne Gospels. A manuscript of the four Gospels, illuminated with extraordinary skill and intricacy, each page a world of interlocking patterns and stylized figures that draws on Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and classical Mediterranean traditions simultaneously. It is one of those objects that makes you realize that the early medieval period, whatever else it was not culturally impoverished. The people who made the Lindisfarne Gospels were sophisticated artists working in a rich and complex tradition. And at Wearmouth Jarrow, a twin monastery on the Tyne and the Wear in what is now County Durham, a monk named Bede was doing something equally extraordinary. He was writing history, real history, careful and critical, and based on sources that Bede had gone to considerable trouble to collect from across Britain and the continent. His greatest work, the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, the ecclesiastical history of the English people, written and completed in 731, is one of the foundational texts of English history. Everything we know about the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, about the political history of the early English kingdoms, about the culture and intellectual life of early Christian England, is filtered through Bede. He is indispensable, and he is brilliant, and he had the good fortune to be working in one of the best-equipped scriptoriums in the Western world. But Bede tells the story from a particular perspective. He tells it as the story of the English. He is interested in the Britons only insofar as they interact with the English, and his view of the Britons is not flattering. He accuses them of failing to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons, of keeping the gift of Christianity to themselves out of hatred for their conquerors. He draws a sharp line between the English, who are in his view doing God's work, and the Britons, who are in his view failing in their duty. This Bedan perspective has had an enormous influence on how the story of post-Roman Britain has been told ever since. Bede set the template. He defined who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, and for most of the subsequent history of British historiography, his framework has been remarkably persistent. But Bede's framework is, at bottom, a framework that serves the interests of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And the Britons had a different framework, a different way of understanding the same events. And that framework, the Brittonic framework, is preserved in the Welsh sources, in the poetry of Taliesin and Aneurin, in the genealogies and histories of the Welsh kingdoms, and ultimately in the legend of Arthur. The difference between these two frameworks is not just academic. It is about identity, about who belongs in Britain and who does not, about who the rightful heirs of the land are. And these questions, which were very live and very urgent in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries, have never entirely gone away. Let us talk about the landscape itself, because one of the things that the story of post-Roman Britain tends to lose sight of is the physical world in which all of this was happening, the fields and forests and rivers and hills and coasts of the island, because the landscape shaped the story in ways that are easy to overlook when you are focused on the political and military narrative. Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries was very different from the Britain of today. The forests were much denser. Vast areas of the Midlands and the south that are now farmland were covered with oak woodland that had been cleared, in part, during the Roman period, but had begun to regenerate as the Roman agricultural system broke down. Marshes and wetlands were more extensive. The river systems were broader and less channeled. The roads, the Roman roads that had been such a marvel of the provincial period, were still there, still followable, but already beginning to deteriorate in places where nobody was maintaining them. Weeds pushing up through the stone surfaces, bridges rotting where nobody had the resources or the organization to replace the timbers. This landscape was not empty. People were living in it, farming it, hunting in it, fishing its rivers and coasts. But the density of settlement and the pattern of land use were changing rapidly. In the east, where Anglo-Saxon settlers were coming in and claiming land, new patterns of settlement were emerging, different from the Roman patterns, organized around the needs of farming communities that were managing their land collectively in ways that would eventually become the open field system of medieval England. In the west, the farming patterns were more continuous with the late Roman period. Small farms on the same sites that had been farmed for generations, growing the same crops, maintaining the same kinds of field boundaries, managed by the same kinds of extended family groups that had always managed them. And everywhere, in the interstices of the settled landscape, there was wildness. Wolves, bears, wild boar, species that had been present in Britain throughout the Roman period, but that had been kept in check by a combination of hunting and the simple pressure of human settlement. As that settlement thinned and contracted in certain areas, the wildness crept back in. The forests expanded. The animals returned. There is something both melancholy and beautiful about this image. The ruins of Roman villas slowly disappearing under moss and bramble. The forum of some mid-sized town gradually becoming a meadow where cattle grazed. The stone columns of its colonnaded portico still visible above the grass, but no longer serving any purpose. The roads winding through empty landscape, still straight, still pointing toward cities that no longer functioned as cities. And over all of this, the sky of Britain, cloudy and grey and changeable, raining on Roman ruins and Anglo-Saxon halls and Brittonic hill forts alike, indifferent to the political upheavals of the puny creatures who lived beneath it. The archaeology of this period has something to say about the emotional dimensions of the experience, not just the material ones. There is a site in Somerset, at a place called South Cadbury, which is of course the Cadbury Castle we have already discussed. And at this site, in the late 4th and 5th centuries, there is evidence of a practice that is very interesting. People were burying objects near the stone walls of the Roman-era structures that stood there, Coins, fragments of pottery, small personal items, and in some cases, they were burying people near these structures in ways that suggest the structures themselves had acquired a kind of sacred significance. This is a pattern that archaeologists have noted at other sites as well. Roman buildings, particularly large and impressive ones, seem to have become associated with the past in a way that gave them a kind of reverence. They were old. They were built by people who had power and knowledge that the present inhabitants did not have. And that gap, that distance between the impressive ruins and the more modest capabilities of the people who now lived near them, generated a kind of awe that expressed itself in ritual behavior. The people of post-Roman Britain were living among the monuments of a civilization they could no longer fully understand or replicate. The stone buildings, the roads, the walls, the tile floors, the hippocausts, the systems for heating buildings with underfloor pipes, all of this was still there, still visible, still in some cases still usable. But the knowledge of how to maintain it, how to build more of it, how to keep the whole system functioning, was fading. The specialists were gone, or scattered, or had died without passing on their knowledge. There is a great sadness in this image, and also, if you are honest about it, a great fascination, because the people of this period were not simply living in the shadow of Rome, they were reinventing themselves, remaking their world from the materials available to them, which included the ruins of Rome as one material among many. The great churches of the early Christian period in Britain were often built on or near Roman sites. Sometimes they incorporated Roman stones, Roman bricks, Roman tiles into their fabric, not because the builders did not know the difference between Roman and non-Roman building materials, but because those materials were there, available, and already associated with a kind of authority and permanence that the new communities wanted to claim for themselves. This is what scholars call spoliation, the reuse of material from older buildings. And spoliation is, in its way, a form of cultural argument. When you take the stones of the Roman Forum and use them to build a Christian church, you are saying something. You are saying that the authority once associated with the Forum now belongs to the church. You are claiming continuity, claiming inheritance, claiming that your institutions and your God are the legitimate successors of the old order. The Anglo-Saxons did the same thing, in different ways and for different purposes. They associated Roman ruins with giants, with the work of beings more powerful than themselves. They called them enter gewiork, the work of giants. They were awed by the ruins, even as they were unable to maintain or replicate them. And they incorporated the ruins into their own sacred geography, using old Roman amphitheaters for assemblies, building their churches inside or adjacent to old Roman walls, treating the ruins as markers of an antique holiness that they could access but not fully understand. This relationship between the people of post-Roman Britain and the ruins that surrounded them is one of the most psychologically interesting aspects of the entire period, and it is a relationship that runs very deep, that shapes the way later generations thought about the past and about what had been lost and what had survived. Now let us talk about the North again, but from a different angle. Let us talk about the Picts. The Picts have always been enigmatic. Even in antiquity, the Roman writers who mentioned them seemed unsure quite what to make of them. They were brave fighters. They were difficult to defeat in their own terrain. They had a habit of using tactics that the Romans found difficult to counter, including the use of light cavalry and the exploitation of the rough highland landscape. And they had, apparently, a distinctive cultural practice that the Romans noted with fascination and some bewilderment. They decorated their bodies with designs, either tattoos or painted marks, that were elaborate enough to be distinctive and significant. The Picts appear in the historical record most clearly in moments of conflict. They are the people who pressure Hadrian's Wall, who cause trouble on the frontier, who eventually participate in the barbarian conspiracy of 367. After the Roman period, they appear as the northern power, the kingdom or collection of kingdoms that controls most of what is now Scotland, north of the Firth of Forth and Firth of Clyde. But here is what makes the Picts so interesting from the perspective of the post-Roman period. They were not simply raiders and warriors, they were builders. The symbol stones I mentioned earlier are evidence of a sophisticated artistic tradition. But the Picts also built forts, some of them quite impressive structures, and maintained a political system complex enough to produce the kind of coordinated military action that allowed them to defeat Roman expeditions and conduct operations deep into Brittonic and later Northumbrian territory. The question of what happened to the Picts is one of the most dramatic in all of early medieval history, because the Picts simply disappear from the historical record in the middle of the 9th century. They are present and important, and named in the sources up to around 840. And then they are gone. Not conquered in any battle we can identify, not absorbed gradually over centuries. Simply gone. Replaced in the historical record by the Kingdom of Alba, the Kingdom of Scotland, which emerges at around the same time and which is ruled by a dynasty of Irish origin from Dalriata. What happened? Why do the Picts disappear? The question has generated enormous debate. Some historians think it was a violent conquest, that the Dalriatan king, Kenneth MacAlpin, conquered the Picts by military force. Others think it was a political merger, a dynastic union that was essentially peaceful. Still others think the Picts were not destroyed or absorbed, but simply renamed, that they continued as a people under a different political framework and eventually became simply Scottish. The answer is probably somewhere in all of these possibilities simultaneously. The Pictish aristocracy intermarried with Dalriatan aristocracy. The political centre of gravity shifted. The name Pict fell out of use because it no longer served the same political purposes. And the Pictish symbol tradition, so vivid and so distinctive, faded away, replaced by the Christian imagery that the new kingdom promoted as part of its own legitimacy. But the Picts did not entirely disappear. Their DNA is in the Scottish people. Their symbol stones still stand in the fields and museums of northeastern Scotland. And their contribution to the culture and gene pool of northern Britain is part of the foundation on which Scotland was built. The 8th century in Britain is a period that is often overshadowed by what comes before and after it. Before it, the dramatic crisis of the 5th and 6th centuries. After it, the Viking Age. But the 8th century has its own story to tell, its own particular character, its own crises and achievements. In England, the 8th century is above all the century of Mercia. Mercia is a kingdom in the Midlands that had been growing in power since the 7th century, and in the 8th century it becomes, under a succession of powerful kings of whom the most famous is Offa, the dominant power in England south of the Humber. Offa ruled from 757 to 796, nearly 40 years, and during those 40 years he transformed Mercia from a regional power into something approaching a national one. He called himself, in his charters, Rex Anglorum, King of the English. He corresponded with Charlemagne on terms of something approaching equality. He reformed the English coinage, introducing a new silver penny that bore his name and that set the standard for English coin production for centuries. He built dikes, earthworks, defensive barriers along his borders, and he built Offa's Dyke. Offa's Dyke is one of the most extraordinary structures in Britain, a linear earthwork, a bank and ditch combination, running for roughly 240 kilometres along the frontier between Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms. Some sections of it are still visible and impressive today, great banks of earth rising to several metres in height. The ditch on the Welsh side still clearly defined. The scale of the enterprise is staggering. The engineering required to plan and build such a structure, to organise the labour necessary to move that much earth, to maintain some kind of coordinated effort over what must have been years of construction. All of this speaks to a level of administrative capacity and political authority that would have been unthinkable in the chaos of the 5th century. Offa's Dyke is, among other things, a statement. It says, here is the border. On this side is England. On that side is Wales. The two are different, and the difference is to be marked and maintained. It is also, of course, completely unlike a Roman wall in its nature. Hadrian's Wall was a military fortification, a physical barrier that could be defended by soldiers stationed along its length. Offa's Dyke was not primarily a military structure. You could cross it. There were places where it was clearly interrupted, where roads or paths crossed it in a way that would have been easy to pass. It was more of a legal and symbolic boundary than a military one, a line on the landscape that said, beyond here, different rules apply. The existence of Offa's Dyke tells us something important about the state of Britain in the late 8th century. It tells us that the boundary between the English kingdoms and the Welsh kingdoms had become sufficiently permanent and sufficiently important to be worth marking on a large scale. The frontier that had been fluid and contested in the 5th and 6th centuries was hardening into something that looked more like a permanent border. The two worlds were separating, but even as that separation was being formalized in earth and ditches, connections remained. Trade continued across the border, intermarriage continued. The Welsh and English courts were aware of each other, sometimes allied with each other against common enemies. The Welsh language was being borrowed into Old English and vice versa. The boundary was a boundary, but it was not a wall in any total sense. And then, in 793, everything changed again. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it with unusual terseness, which itself speaks to the shock of it. On the 8th of June, it says, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne, with plunder and slaughter. Lindisfarne, the sacred island, the monastery founded by Aidan, the home of the Lindisfarne Gospels, the heart of Northumbrian Christianity, attacked by sea-borne raiders from across the North Sea. The Vikings had arrived. The Viking Age is sometimes presented as beginning, with a kind of bang, a single moment of violent rupture that marks the end of one period and the beginning of another. And in one sense, that is not wrong. The raid on Lindisfarne was indeed shocking, indeed a rupture, indeed the beginning of something new. But in another sense, the Viking raids were a continuation of a process that had been going on for centuries. Sea-borne raiders from Scandinavia attacking the coasts of Britain. This was not new. What was new was the scale, the organization, and ultimately the ambition of the Norse raiders. They were not, or not only, interested in a single raid and a quick return home. They were interested in something much larger. But let us not rush ahead. Let us stay for a moment with what the raid on Lindisfarne meant for the people of Britain in 793. For those people, it was not simply a raid, it was an omen, a terrible sign. The scholar Alcuin of York, who was at the time at the court of Charlemagne, wrote a letter to the people of Northumbria in which he expressed his horror at the attack. He saw it as punishment for sin. He asked, what security can the churches of Britain have if Lindisfarne has suffered this? He was voicing a profound anxiety that went beyond the loss of property and lives. The sacredness of Lindisfarne had been violated. The distance between the familiar and the terrifying had suddenly shrunk, and in the years that followed, the distance shrank further and further. The raids continued. They spread from Lindisfarne northward into Scotland and southward along the eastern and western coasts of England. They reached Ireland. They reached the Frankish coast. They reached Spain and Portugal and the Mediterranean. And slowly, the nature of what the Norse were doing in Britain changed. From raiding to something else, to settlement. This is the story that the next phase of British history tells. The story of how Norse settlers, coming in ever larger numbers, settled in the north and east of England, in the areas that became known as the Danelaw, how they mixed with the local population, how they contributed their language and their place names and their legal traditions and their artistic styles to the already complex mixture of cultures that made up post-Roman Britain. But the story of the Viking Age is a new chapter, and it belongs to a different part of this long night's journey through the chaos that followed Rome. Let us use this moment to step back and think about what 400 years of chaos looks like from the inside, not from the outside, looking in at a landscape of ruins and violence and cultural loss, but from the inside, from the perspective of the people who lived through it. 400 years is a long time. It is longer than the entire history of the United States of America. It is longer than the span from Shakespeare's time to our own. And in those 400 years, the people of Britain were not simply suffering passively through catastrophe. They were living. They were loving and hating and laughing and grieving and building and destroying and thinking and creating. They were making communities and raising children and burying their dead and trying to make sense of a world that had changed profoundly and would never be the same again. There is a particular quality to the experience of living through the end of one world and the beginning of another. It is not like living through a normal historical transition, a change of government, or a shift in economic policy. It is more fundamental than that. It touches the categories through which people understand who they are and what they belong to. It raises questions that do not have easy answers. What language should my children speak? What gods should I worship? What obligations do I have to the community I was born into? And what obligations do I have to the new powers that have taken control of the landscape? What does it mean to be a good person in a world where the rules have changed? The people of post-Roman Britain were asking these questions, sometimes explicitly, in the writings of people like Gildas, who clearly felt the weight of the transition very heavily. More often, implicitly, in the choices they made about how to live and what to pass on to their children. And what they passed on, what survived the 400 years of chaos, is remarkable. The Welsh language, the Irish Christian tradition that would eventually evangelize Scotland and northern England and leave its mark on the whole of European Christianity. The memory of Rome, transformed into something new, into the legend of a golden age that had been lost and might someday be recovered. The roads, still there, still usable, even if unrepaired. The fields, still farmed, even if the economic system that had organized that farming was gone. The genes of all the peoples who had lived in Britain since the Ice Age, mixed and remixed in ways that still show up in the population genetics of modern Britain. And the stories above all. The story of a boy taken from Britain to Ireland as a slave who returned to change the world. The story of a war leader at a battle of Baden Hill who turned the tide against the invaders. The story of warriors riding south to their deaths and the poet who survived to remember them. The story of a sparrow flying through a warm hall in winter, in through one door and out through another, in from the dark and back into the dark, with just a moment in the light in between. These are the stories that came out of the chaos, and they are, in their way, worth the chaos that produced them. Or at least, they are all that we have now to set against that chaos, and they are enough. Because this is what history teaches, or ought to teach, that human beings are resilient in ways that defy expectation. That civilization, once established, is harder to destroy than it looks from the outside. That the things that matter most, language, culture, story, identity, the sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, these things have a way of surviving even the most catastrophic upheavals. Diminished, transformed, sometimes unrecognizable to those who knew them before, but surviving. The Britain that emerged from the 400 years of chaos between the Roman withdrawal and the Viking Age was not the Britain that Rome had made. It was something new, something that combined Roman and Brittonic and Irish and Anglo-Saxon and Pictish elements in proportions that varied from region to region. It was a Britain that was in many ways poorer and more violent and less sophisticated than what had come before. But it was also a Britain that was more itself, more distinctive, more shaped by the particularity of the island and its people than the provincial appendage of a Mediterranean empire had been. And out of that particular Britain, over the following centuries, the Kingdom of England would eventually emerge. And from that kingdom, in various ways and for various reasons, much of the modern world would eventually grow. The chaos was not the end, it was the beginning. Let us go back to specifics now, because I do not want to get too philosophical when there is so much concrete history still to explore. We have talked about the broad outlines of the post-Roman period. We have talked about the collapse of the Roman administrative system, the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, the survival of the Brittonic kingdoms in the West, the legend of Arthur, the Irish missionary tradition, the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, the Northumbrian Renaissance, the rise of Mercia, and the first Viking raid. But there are specific stories, specific people, specific moments within this 400-year span that deserve attention, because they illuminate the period in ways that the broad narrative cannot. Let us talk about Cadoc. Cadoc is a 6th century saint associated with Wales and with southwestern England, and his story is one of dozens of similar stories from the early Celtic Christian tradition. He was the son of a Welsh king, educated in a monastery, who became a monk and founded his own monastery and became a healer and a teacher and a patron of learning. The details of his life are preserved in hagiographies, saints' lives, that were written centuries after his death and that mix historical memory with miraculous legend in proportions that are impossible to separate at this distance. But here is what is interesting about Cadoc and his like. These early Welsh saints, these founders of monasteries in the 5th and 6th centuries, were doing something that was both conservative and revolutionary simultaneously. They were conservative in that they were preserving, in their monastic communities, the tradition of Latin learning that had come to Britain with Rome and that was now under threat as the urban centres of Roman civilization declined. They were teaching Latin, copying manuscripts, maintaining the literary tradition that connected Britain to the rest of the Christian world. In their monasteries, the grammar of Priscian and the theology of Augustine of Hippo and the poetry of Virgil were still being read and taught, even as the towns where such things had once been taught in schools were falling silent. But they were revolutionary in that they were creating something new out of these old materials. The monasticism they practiced was different from the monasticism of Egypt and the continents that had theoretically inspired it. It was more intensely ascetic in some ways, more focused on individual spiritual heroism, more comfortable with isolation and hardship. And it was deeply embedded in the kinship structures of Welsh society in ways that continental monasticism was not. The abbots of Welsh monasteries were often members of the ruling families of their kingdoms. The monasteries were integrated into the social and political life of the community in a way that gave them a very different character from the enclosed and separated monasteries of the Benedictine tradition. This Welsh monastic tradition is one of the sources of what we call the Celtic Church, that distinctive form of Christianity that flourished in Ireland and Western Britain in the post-Roman period. And through the Irish missionaries, it had an influence on the whole of early medieval Christianity that is only slowly being recognized. Columba, for example. Columba was an Irish monk, born around 521, who established a monastery on the island of Iona, off the west coast of Scotland, in 563. Iona became one of the most important centres of Christian learning and art in the entire early medieval world. The Book of Kells, one of the greatest works of art of the period, was probably begun at Iona before being transferred to Ireland. The monastery at Iona trained missionaries who spread Christianity across Scotland and into Northumbria. It maintained connections with Ireland, with Wales, with the Frankish kingdom. It was a node in a network that connected the apparently remote western fringes of Britain to the wider world. And Columba himself was a figure of extraordinary complexity. He was a prince who had become a monk, a man of fierce passions who was said to have caused a war in Ireland through his copying of a manuscript without the owner's permission, a man who left Ireland under a kind of penitential exile and found on Iona the isolation and the productive community that his nature demanded. The accounts of his life, written by Adomnan in the late 7th century, are full of stories that show him as both a holy man and a recognizably human one, capable of anger and stubbornness and great tenderness. Stories like Columba matter because they give the period a human face. They remind us that the chaos of post-Roman Britain was experienced by individuals, not by abstractions. Each of those individuals had a particular life, a particular set of relationships, a particular way of making sense of the world they found themselves in. And the world that Columba found himself in was one where the boundary between the human and the supernatural was very permeable, where the miraculous was expected, where the landscape was full of presences, not just human ones, but the presences of saints and angels and demons and the older spirits of the land that Christianity had not entirely succeeded in displacing. The world of Columba and Patrick and Caddock was a haunted world, a world in which the invisible was as real as the visible, in which the dead were not entirely absent from the lives of the living, in which the relationship between humanity and the natural world was understood as one of participation rather than domination. This worldview is very different from the worldview of modern secular rationalism, but it was extraordinarily productive. It generated art and poetry and scholarship of real quality. It produced a tradition of thought about the relationship between humanity and creation that has things to say to a world facing an environmental crisis. And it preserved, through centuries when more sophisticated intellectual traditions might have been lost, the core traditions of Western learning. Now let us go to a specific place and a specific moment that illustrates the complexity of the post-Roman period in a particularly vivid way. Go to the city of Bath, or rather, to the site of what is now Bath, in Somerset in the years around 500. In Roman Britain, Bath was called Aquae Sulis, the waters of soul, named after the goddess of the hot spring that was the original reason for the settlement. The Romans had built an extraordinary complex here, a great bathing establishment centered on the hot spring, with temples and courtyards and elaborate drainage systems. The spring itself, which flows at a constant temperature and at a constant rate regardless of the season, had clearly been sacred long before the Romans arrived. And the Romans, in their characteristically pragmatic way, had incorporated the local goddess Sul into the Roman pantheon, identifying her with Minerva, and built a temple to Sulis Minerva alongside the baths. The dedication offerings thrown into the spring at Aquae Sulis over the centuries of Roman occupation are remarkable. Thousands of objects, coins and jewelry, and little lead tablets inscribed with curses against those who had stolen things or wronged the worshipper in some way, all thrown into the sacred spring as offerings to the goddess. These tablets are a window into the ordinary concerns of ordinary people in Roman Britain, concerns that turn out to be not so different from ours. Lost property, unfair treatment, betrayal by a spouse, the desire for justice. And in the years around 500, the baths were still there, still functioning in a basic sense. The spring was still flowing, as it flows today, at a constant temperature, regardless of what happened to the Roman Empire or the Anglo-Saxons or anyone else. People were still coming to the spring. They were still throwing offerings into it. But the ceremony around the offerings had changed. The elaborate Roman cult of Sulis Minerva was gone, or at least greatly diminished. The temple, which had been one of the most impressive in Roman Britain, was probably partly ruinous by this point. Its roof fallen in, its precinct overgrown. The baths themselves were perhaps still usable in part, but the maintenance that had kept them functioning at full capacity was no longer available. The drains were silting up. The hypocausts that had heated the water were no longer being tended. And yet, people came. They came to the spring because the spring was there, because it was warm and constant and strange, and clearly outside the normal order of things. Because whatever the Romans had built around it, and whatever they had believed about it, the spring itself predated all of that and continued regardless of it. The spring had its own holiness that did not depend on the political structures that had, for 4 centuries, organized the human response to it. This is a moment, a place, where you can see the deep continuity beneath the surface chaos. The spring at Bath was sacred before Rome, sacred during Rome, sacred after Rome. The forms of the sacred changed, the gods changed, the language changed, but the impulse, the human need to encounter something larger than oneself, something that could not be controlled or explained, something that demanded response and acknowledgement, that impulse was continuous. Bath would eventually become a Christian religious centre as the spring continued to attract pilgrims. The old Roman site would be built over and built over again. And today, if you visit the Roman baths in Bath, which are one of the great archaeological sites of Britain, you are standing in the presence of something that has been sacred, in one form or another, for at least 2,000 years, and probably longer. That continuity, that deep continuity beneath the surface change, is part of what the study of the post-Roman period reveals. The chaos is real, the change is real, the violence and the loss are real. But so is the continuity. The island endured, its people endured, and what they passed on to their descendants, even through the worst of the chaos, was more than ruins and fragments. It was the thread of a living tradition. Let us talk now about what happened in the 7th century in England, because the 7th century is a period of particular complexity and particular interest, and it is a period that is often overlooked. By the early 7th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were well established in the east and south of England. The conversion to Christianity, which had begun with Augustine's mission to Kent in 597, was spreading northward and westward, and the kingdoms were increasingly in contact with the Frankish kingdom on the continent, which was in many ways the most powerful political entity in Western Europe in this period. The Frankish connection was important for a number of reasons. It brought continental fashions and technologies into the Anglo-Saxon world. It created diplomatic relationships that gave the Anglo-Saxon kings a certain standing in the wider European world, and it brought Christianity, or at least the Roman Catholic version of Christianity, into contact with the Irish influence version that was coming south from Iona and Northumbria. The tension between these two versions of Christianity was real, and it was about more than the date of Easter. It was about authority. Who had the right to determine how Christianity was practiced in Britain? The Pope in Rome, through his representatives, or the abbots of the great Irish and Iro-Scottish monasteries, who had their own traditions and their own networks of loyalty? This tension was resolved, as I mentioned earlier, at the Synod of Whitby in 1664, but the resolution left traces. It left a sense, particularly in the Celtic-influenced areas of northern Britain, of something lost, of a tradition sacrificed on the altar of conformity. The Celtic Church did not disappear after Whitby, but it was marginalized, its distinctive practices officially discouraged, its authority reduced. And yet the creativity of the Celtic Christian tradition did not disappear. It went on producing extraordinary manuscripts and extraordinary metalwork and extraordinary poems. The tension between the Roman and Celtic traditions within British Christianity was in some ways productive. It generated a richness of cultural exchange that benefited both sides. The 8th century, as I have said, was above all the century of Mercia. But it was also the century of a man who deserves to be much better known than he is, Boniface. Boniface was born in Devon in the southwest of England, probably around 675. He became a monk and an extraordinarily effective missionary, eventually going to the continent and doing more than any other single person to bring the Germanic peoples of what is now Germany and the Low Countries to Christianity. He founded monasteries, established episcopal sees, organized the church in vast territories that had previously had no coherent Christian structure. He was appointed Archbishop of Mainz. He called councils and issued decrees and wrote letters in a Latin of considerable elegance. And he died a martyr's death in 754, killed by a group of pagan Frisians when he was on his way to conduct baptisms. Boniface matters in the story of post-Roman Britain because he represents the export of the remarkable cultural tradition that had been built up in the Anglo-Saxon monasteries of England. The monasteries of Northumbria and Mercia, which had themselves been formed by the confluence of Roman missionary traditions and Celtic Christian traditions, produced a generation of scholars and missionaries who went out into the world and had an impact far beyond the island. Boniface was the most famous of them, but there were others, many others, spreading across the continent, founding schools and monasteries, bringing manuscripts from England to continental libraries, acting as conduits for the remarkable intellectual tradition that had flourished in what was, in global terms, a rather remote corner of the world. This is one of the great ironies of the post-Roman period. Britain, which had been on the periphery of the Roman Empire, which had been one of the last provinces to be incorporated and among the first to be abandoned, became in the 7th and 8th centuries one of the most important centers of Christian learning in the Western world. The chaos had not destroyed intellectual life. It had, in some ways, created the conditions for a new kind of intellectual life, different from the Roman model, but in some respects more creative and more energetic. The reason for this is at least partly structural. In the late Roman period, learning was concentrated in the cities, in the great urban schools that were the inheritors of the classical tradition. When the cities collapsed, that tradition was threatened. But in Britain and Ireland, learning had migrated into the monasteries before the worst of the collapse happened. And the monasteries, precisely because they were not cities, because they were often in remote and defensible locations, were more resistant to the disruptions of the post-Roman period. They preserved what the cities could not. And so, paradoxically, the very peripherality of Britain, the very fact that it had always been on the edge of things, made it a better vessel for preserving the tradition when the centre could no longer hold. Now let us talk about something that happened in the late 7th century that has fascinated historians and archaeologists for generations. In 1939, in a field on the Sutton Hoo estate in Suffolk in eastern England, excavators opened a burial mound and found, at the centre of it, the ghost of a ship. The ship itself had long rotted away, but the iron rivets that had held its planks together were still there, in their original positions, tracing the outline of a great clinker-built vessel nearly 27 meters long. And in the centre of the ship, in what had been a burial chamber, they found treasure. The Sutton Hoo treasure is one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made in Britain. There was a magnificent helmet, reconstructed from hundreds of fragments, with a face mask of extraordinary artistry, combining Germanic and classical traditions in a way that speaks to the complex cultural world of 7th century East Anglia. There was a shield with decorative fittings that show connections to Scandinavia. There was a great gold buckle of staggering craftsmanship, decorated with interlocking animal patterns of breathtaking intricacy. There were drinking vessels, weapons, armor, musical instruments, objects from as far away as Constantinople and Egypt. And there was no body. The Sutton Hoo ship burial is believed to be the grave of a king of East Anglia, possibly Raedwald, who died around 625, and the absence of a body may mean that Raedwald was a Christian at the time of his death, or had Christian connections, and that his body was given a Christian burial elsewhere. But the burial rite itself, the ship burial, the grave goods, the magnificent warrior equipment, all of this is pagan in its origins, rooted in the Germanic and Scandinavian traditions that the East Anglians had brought with them from the continent. The Sutton Hoo burial is a moment frozen in time, a snapshot of the cultural world of 7th century Britain in all its complexity. A world that was pagan and Christian simultaneously, that was Germanic and classical simultaneously, that was looking west toward the older traditions of the island and east toward the continent and the wider world. A world that was producing objects of extraordinary beauty, even in the midst of political instability and religious uncertainty. The helmet. Let us stay with the helmet for a moment, because it is one of those objects that reaches across the centuries and demands your attention. It is made of iron, faced with tinned bronze sheets. The face mask is a human face, but it is also something more than that, something that seems almost designed to be terrifying as much as beautiful. The eyebrows are inlaid with silver wire, and at the ends of the eyebrows, where you would expect tails, there are heads of animals. The nose of the helmet forms the body of a flying dragon. The face mask turns the wearer into something more than human, something that bridges the world of men and the world of spirits. Whoever wore this helmet was making a statement. They were saying, I am not just a man, I am a king. And a king, in the world of 7th century East Anglia, was not just a political leader. He was a warrior and a priest, and a figure who mediated between the human community and the forces that governed the world. The helmet made him visible in that role. It transformed him, when he put it on, into the kind of being that the old stories were about. And this is the thing about the post-Roman period that the Sutton Hoo burial illuminates so well. It was a world of tremendous cultural energy, a world in which new forms were being created out of old materials, in which Germanic and Celtic and Roman and Christian and pagan traditions were colliding and mixing and generating things that none of them could have produced alone. It was a world of violence and instability, certainly, but it was also a world of extraordinary creativity. The 400 years between the Roman withdrawal and the Viking Age were not simply a period of decline and loss. They were a period of transformation, of painful, violent, creative transformation, of the making of something new. And that something new is us, or rather, it is the world that eventually became us. The languages we speak, the stories we tell, the sense of national identity that, however problematized and contested it may be in our time, continues to shape how we understand ourselves in relation to our history. The people of post-Roman Britain did not know they were creating the foundations of modern Britain and Ireland. They were just trying to survive, to maintain what they valued, to pass something on to their children. But what they created in the process, the particular combination of traditions and memories and languages and stories that came out of the chaos, is part of who we are. And that seems worth knowing. Let us go back one more time to the very beginning of our story, to that moment in the early 5th century when the connection to Rome finally snapped, and ask a final question. Not what happened, but why it matters. Why does it matter what happened in Britain between the departure of the Romans and the arrival of the Vikings? Why should we care about the obscure kingdoms of the Brittonic North, the poetry of Y. Gododin, the symbol stones of the Picts, the metalwork of the Sutton Hoo treasure, the debate about the date of Easter at the Synod of Whitby? The obvious answer is that it is our history, and we should care about our history because it made us what we are. But I want to suggest a deeper reason. We live in a world of enormous complexity and enormous uncertainty, a world in which the structures and institutions that we have come to rely on feel, to at least some people, more fragile than they used to. The climate is changing, The political order is under stress. Technologies are transforming the nature of work and communication and human identity in ways that are difficult to predict. And in this world, the story of what happened to the people of post-Roman Britain has something to say to us. Not as a simple lesson. History does not offer simple lessons, but as a testimony. A testimony to the fact that human communities can survive the collapse of the structures they have depended on, that they can find new ways to organize themselves, new forms of community and culture and meaning in the aftermath of catastrophe, that what survives the chaos is not always what you would expect, and what emerges from the chaos can be something genuinely new and genuinely valuable. The people of post-Roman Britain lost their connection to the greatest empire the ancient world had ever produced. They lost their cities and their trade networks and their coinage and their administrative structures. They faced violence and famine and epidemic and the grinding uncertainty of not knowing what the world was going to look like in a generation's time. And they made Welsh, and they made Old English, and they made Iona and Lindisfarne and the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels. And they made the legend of Arthur and the poetry of Y. Gododin and the stories of Patrick and Columba and Brendan. And they made Beowulf and the ecclesiastical history and the Sutton Hoo helmet. And they made, in the end, Britain. Not a perfect Britain, not a just Britain, not a Britain that we would want to live in, with its violence and its inequality and its terror, but a Britain that endured, a Britain that held something of value through the worst of times, a Britain that, when the worst was over, was ready to become something else. That is what the 400 years of chaos teach us. Not that chaos is good, or that loss is acceptable, or that violence can be redeemed by the culture it destroys and creates, but that human resilience is real, that the things that matter most are harder to destroy than the things that matter least, that stories and languages and identities can survive what empires cannot, and that the darkness, however deep it goes, is never the end of the story. There is one more thing worth saying before we let sleep take over entirely. One more thread to pull, one more layer to look beneath. Because we have been talking about what happened to the people of Britain after Rome, but we have not yet talked enough about the things that did not change, the things that persisted across the chaos unchanged, or almost unchanged, that served as anchors for communities adrift in uncertainty. The land itself, obviously, the hills and rivers and coastlines of Britain did not change when Rome left. The Thames still ran to the sea. The Severn still flooded its valley in winter. The high ground of Wales and the Scottish Highlands was still there, still cold, still offering the same combination of defensibility and difficulty that it had always offered. The agricultural rhythms imposed by the landscape did not change. Seed time and harvest, the movement of animals to and from summer pastures, the fishing seasons on the coasts, the gathering of fuel for winter. These rhythms were older than Rome, and they continued after Rome was gone. The plants continued. The wild plants that the people of Britain had relied on for food and medicine and building materials since before the Romans came continued to grow in the same places where they had always grown. The knowledge of those plants, which plants to eat and when, which to use for medicine and how, which to avoid, all of this knowledge was in the heads of the people, and it survived the collapse of the political and administrative system that had organized Roman Britain. It was the deep knowledge, the knowledge that the land itself carried, and that the people had learned from the land over centuries. The animals continued, the domesticated animals, cattle and sheep and pigs and horses and dogs. That had been the foundation of the agricultural economy of Roman Britain, did not disappear when the political system changed. They went on being bred and tended and slaughtered and eaten. The agricultural knowledge that supported them, the knowledge of how to manage pasture, how to keep animals healthy through the winter, how to breed for the qualities you wanted. All of this continued. It was passed from parent to child, from farmer to apprentice, through all the chaos of the political and military changes. Because it had to be. You could not afford to lose it. The skills of the hand continued. Weaving and spinning and pottery making and leatherwork and woodworking and all the other manual skills that kept communities clothed and housed and equipped. These skills did not require a political system to support them. They required practice and transmission, person to person, generation to generation, and they were transmitted, even through the worst of the post-Roman period. The pottery found at sites from the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain is not as sophisticated as the pottery of the Roman period. The fine Samian ware from Gaul, the red gloss pottery that had been available all across the Roman Empire, and that archaeologists find at Roman sites throughout Britain, that stopped coming in the early 5th century. But pottery continued to be made in Britain, using local clays and local techniques, serving the same basic functions that pottery had always served. This continuity of the ordinary, of the everyday skills and knowledge and practices that keep communities alive, is the deep history of the post-Roman period, that the dramatic narrative of kingdoms and battles and saints' lives tends to obscure. The kings and the monks and the warriors made the history that was recorded and remembered. But the farmers and the craftspeople and the healers made the conditions under which any history was possible at all. It is worth remembering them. It is worth holding their anonymous experience alongside the named individuals whose stories we have been telling, because the post-Roman period in Britain was not just the story of what the elite did to each other and to the landscape. It was the story of what ordinary people did to survive. And what they did, more often than not, was exactly what needed doing. They planted and harvested and wove and built and healed and buried their dead and raised their children and told their stories and kept the fire going through the night. They were, in the deepest sense, the continuity that made everything else possible. And that is where we leave them. In the fields and the workshops and the households of Britain, 1500 years ago, doing the ordinary, extraordinary work of keeping life going. The Romans are gone. The chaos is real. The future is uncertain. But the fire is burning, and the children are sleeping, and tomorrow the sun will rise again over the same hills and rivers and coasts that it has always risen over. That is enough. That is always enough. Good night. Now let us follow the thread deeper, because we have been talking about the large movements of history, the kingdoms and the wars and the religious transformations. And there is another level to this story that deserves attention. The level of the ordinary, the level of what it was actually like to wake up in the morning in post-Roman Britain and get through the day. We have some remarkable windows into this level. Not many and not clear ones, but they exist, and they tell a story that is different from the story of kings and battles, different from the story of saints and miracles, a story of the everyday human effort to keep life going when the systems that had supported it were no longer there. Take food, the most basic thing. In Roman Britain, food production had been organized around a market economy. Farmers on villa estates produced surplus crops that were sold to the towns. Merchants transported goods from where they were produced to where they were needed. The army was supplied through a sophisticated logistical system that moved grain and other commodities over long distances, and imported foods, olive oil, wine, garum, the fermented fish sauce that the Romans used on everything, came into Britain through the ports and were distributed along the trade network. All of this collapsed in the 5th century. Not overnight, but progressively. The market for surplus crops shrank as the towns shrank. The merchants and their supply chains disappeared. The army stopped being supplied from outside. The imports dried up. What replaced it was a much more localized, much more subsistence-based food economy. People grew food for themselves and their immediate communities. They ate what they could produce locally. They had less variety, almost certainly less nutrition in some respects, less security against a bad harvest. But they did not starve, except when the harvest was genuinely terrible, which happened occasionally. The agricultural knowledge of Britain did not disappear with the Roman administrative system. The farmers knew how to farm. They knew which soils to cultivate and which to avoid. They knew how to manage livestock through the winter. They knew how to preserve food for the lean months. And they knew, because they had always known this, that the security of the group depended on sharing what you had with your neighbours, because your neighbours would share with you when your need was greater than theirs. This mutual obligation, this network of reciprocal duty, was in some ways the fundamental institution of post-Roman Britain. It was not Roman. It was older than Rome. It was the way human communities had always organized themselves before states and markets came along to provide alternative mechanisms for distribution and security. And when the states and markets failed, it was still there, still functional, still capable of keeping communities alive. The economic historian can call this subsistence agriculture. The sociologist can call it community reciprocity. The ordinary person living in the 6th century would not have called it anything. It was just how you lived. You helped your neighbours, and they helped you, and everyone got through the winter. Now let us talk about medicine. Because medicine in post-Roman Britain is a subject of real interest and real complexity. Roman medicine, at its best, was sophisticated. It drew on Greek medical traditions, particularly on the work of Galen, which organized medical knowledge around systematic theories of the body and its functioning. Roman physicians in Britain had access to imported drugs from across the Mediterranean world. They had instruments, surgical tools of considerable sophistication. They had the Latin medical literature, which preserved and transmitted the accumulated knowledge of centuries. After Rome, that tradition was partially, but not entirely lost in Britain. The Latin texts survived in the monasteries. Some of the monks who copied and studied them were genuinely interested in their medical content and tried to apply it in the care of the sick. The monastic communities of the Celtic Church in particular had a strong tradition of healing as part of their practice. Saints healed people. Monks tended the sick. The boundary between prayer and medicine was not clearly drawn, but the elaborate pharmaceutical knowledge that had been available in Roman Britain, the access to drugs from the Eastern Mediterranean, the ability to consult specialists, all of this was greatly reduced. People fell back on local plants, on folk remedies, on the accumulated knowledge of their communities about what helped and what did not, and on prayer and on the intercession of saints and on the ritual practices that had always been part of how ordinary people dealt with illness, not just in Britain, but everywhere. One of the fascinating things that archaeologists have found at early medieval sites in Britain is evidence of what they cautiously call healing practices. Burials with objects that seem to be connected to medicine or healing. The graves of women who were buried with the tools of their trade, which included forceps and needles and small containers that had once held ointments or drugs. These women were not professional physicians in any Roman sense, but they were practitioners of something. They had knowledge that their communities valued. They were the people you went to when you were sick or injured. This tradition of female healers, of wise women with knowledge of plants and remedies, runs through the early medieval period in Britain and Ireland and connects on one side to the female medical practitioners of the Roman period and on the other side to the much later tradition of herbalists and midwives that persisted into the early modern period. It is a tradition that has often been dismissed or demonized, most notoriously in the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. But it was a real tradition, a tradition of practical knowledge that kept people alive in conditions where no other medical help was available. Let us talk about trade, because even in the darkest years of the post-Roman period, trade did not entirely stop. It contracted dramatically. It became more local, more intermittent, less organized, but it continued. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for this is the Mediterranean pottery that has been found at a number of high-status sites in Western Britain and Ireland, dating to the 5th and 6th centuries. This pottery, which archaeologists call aware and beware depending on its precise origin, came from the eastern Mediterranean, from the Aegean and the coast of what is now Turkey and the Levant. It arrived in Britain somehow, presumably by ship, on routes that we cannot trace in any detail. What it tells us is that the elite communities of Western Britain in this period were still connected to the wider world, not through the Roman road network and the Roman administrative system, through something else, through the sea routes that had always connected the Atlantic coasts of Europe, and that had, if anything, become more important as the land routes deteriorated. The western coasts of Britain, Wales and Cornwall, and the southwest peninsula were part of a maritime network that connected them to Ireland, to Brittany, to the Iberian Peninsula, and through those connections to the wider Mediterranean world. This network was not Roman. It predated Rome. It was the Atlantic trading world that had always existed on the fringes of the Roman Empire and that continued to function after Rome was gone. And it was carrying things, pottery from the East Mediterranean, perhaps wine in amphorae, some of which have been found at these same sites, perhaps oil, perhaps spices, perhaps other luxury goods, and in return, what was going out? Probably tin from the tin mines of Cornwall that had been supplying the ancient world since before recorded history, probably hides and slaves, possibly silver and other metals, possibly dogs which the Irish and British were famous for breeding and which were much sought after throughout the ancient world. This trade was small-scale by Roman standards. It was irregular and unpredictable, but it was real, and it maintained, in attenuated form, the connections between Britain and the wider world that had been one of the defining features of the Roman period. The holy sites are also part of the economic story, because pilgrimage was not just a religious practice, it was an economic driver. The pilgrim routes, the sacred springs, the shrines of saints, all of these attracted visitors who needed to be fed and housed and supplied. They generated economic activity around them, and they created networks of connection between distant communities that were as valuable for the exchange of information and goods as they were for spiritual purposes. The shrine of St. Alban at Verulamium, which became St. Albans, continued to attract pilgrims through the worst years of the post-Roman period. The sacred springs of Bath continued to draw visitors. The monastery at Iona, which was on an island that you could only reach by sea, nonetheless attracted pilgrims and scholars from across Britain and Ireland and eventually from the continent. The desire to visit holy places was not extinguished by the collapse of the Roman infrastructure. It found new routes, new ways of making the journey possible. And in making those journeys possible, in maintaining the networks of road and sea route and hospitality that allowed pilgrims to travel, the early medieval church was doing something that was economically significant, even if it was not economically motivated. It was maintaining the infrastructure of connectivity at a time when that infrastructure would otherwise have been allowed to fall completely apart. This is one of the reasons why the church matters so much to the story of post-Roman Britain. Not just as a religious institution, not just as a keeper of learning and culture, but as an institution that maintained, through the worst of the chaos, the minimum necessary infrastructure for trade and communication and the movement of people and ideas. Let us now go back to the question of language, because the linguistic history of post-Roman Britain is one of the most fascinating and most complex aspects of the period, and it raises questions that historians are still arguing about. When the Romans left Britain, the population of the island was predominantly Brittonic-speaking, meaning they spoke a form of the language that would eventually become Welsh and Cornish, and, through the migration of Britons to Brittany, Breton. There was also a substantial population of Latin speakers, particularly among the educated classes in the towns and among the soldiers and administrators of the late Roman period. By the time the historical record becomes clear again in the 7th and 8th centuries, much of what is now England is speaking Old English, a Germanic language brought by the Anglo-Saxon settlers from the continent. Welsh, Cornish, and Cumbric, the Brittonic language of the north, survive in the west and north. Latin survives as the language of the church and of scholarship. How did this transformation happen? How did a predominantly Brittonic-speaking population become predominantly Old English-speaking over the course of roughly 2 centuries? This is one of the most hotly contested questions in British historical linguistics. There are 2 broad schools of thought. The first holds that the change was the result of a genuine population replacement, that large numbers of Anglo-Saxon settlers moved into Britain, and that the Brittonic-speaking population was either killed, enslaved, or driven out of the areas that became Anglo-Saxon England, to the point where the Brittonic linguistic tradition was effectively extinguished there. On this view, the English are, genetically and culturally, largely descended from the Anglo-Saxon immigrants. The second school holds that the change was primarily cultural rather than demographic, that the Anglo-Saxon settlers were a relatively small elite who imposed their language on a much larger, Brittonic-speaking population that remained in place. On this view, the English are largely descended from the Brittonic-speaking people of post-Roman Britain, who learned Old English rather than Welsh, because Old English was the language of power and prestige in the new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The genetic evidence is interesting but not decisive. Studies of the genetics of modern British populations do show a strong signal of descent from populations that arrived in Britain in the period corresponding to the Anglo-Saxon migration. But those populations are not easy to distinguish genetically from the earlier Brittonic populations, because the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons were both descended ultimately from the same broad European genetic stock. The linguistic evidence is also interesting. Old English shows very little influence from Brittonic languages. The number of Brittonic loanwords in Old English is tiny, much smaller than you would expect if large numbers of Brittonic speakers had been learning Old English as a second language. When populations mix linguistically, they tend to bring vocabulary from their original language into the language they are learning. The near absence of this in Old English suggests either that the Brittonic-speaking population was very small in the Anglo-Saxon areas, or that the social segregation between Britons and Anglo-Saxons was so complete that linguistic mixing was minimal. But the place names tell a different story. The map of England is full of Brittonic place names, particularly for rivers and hills and other geographical features. The Thames, the Avon, the Exe, the Wye, the Severn, all Brittonic. The names of many English hills and mountains have Brittonic origins, and this is what you would expect if there had been a Brittonic-speaking population in these areas that the Anglo-Saxons encountered and displaced or absorbed. The Anglo-Saxons adopted the existing names for the features of the landscape that they found when they arrived, because those were the names that the local people used. So the evidence is contradictory, and the honest conclusion is that the transformation from Brittonic to Old English speaking probably happened differently in different areas and at different times through a combination of population replacement in some areas, linguistic shift in others, and various intermediate processes in still others. What is clear is that the transformation was complete in the areas that became England by the 7th or 8th century at the latest. Old English had won. The Brittonic tradition survived only in Wales and Cornwall, and in the north, in the kingdom of Strathclyde that we have already discussed. And the winning of Old English over Brittonic has consequences that echo all the way to the present. Because Old English is the ancestor of modern English, and modern English is, for better or worse, the dominant language of the modern world. The linguistic world we live in today is, in a very real sense, a consequence of what happened in post-Roman Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries. Let us talk now about something that is perhaps surprising to find in a discussion of the post-Roman period. Let us talk about art. The art of post-Roman Britain is extraordinary, not in spite of the chaos, but in many ways because of it. Because when the formal structures that had organized Roman art, the patronage of the state, the demands of the official religion, the expectation that art would conform to established Greco-Roman conventions, when those structures fell away, something happened that is genuinely surprising. The art became more itself, more distinctively British and Irish and Celtic, more rooted in the artistic traditions that had been present in the island before Rome arrived and that had survived the Roman period in various forms. The spiral patterns and interlaced designs that are characteristic of early medieval Celtic art did not appear from nowhere. They had deep roots in the art of the Iron Age, in the Latin tradition that had spread across Europe in the centuries before Rome. And in Britain and Ireland, after Rome, those roots produced new growth. The metalwork of the period is particularly remarkable. Brooches and buckles and harness fittings and book covers decorated with enamel and niello and filigree and intricate patterning that shows a level of technical mastery and artistic sophistication that is genuinely astonishing. The Hunterston brooch from Scotland, the Tara brooch from Ireland, the Kingston brooch from Kent. These objects are not primitive. They are among the finest pieces of jewellery produced anywhere in the world in the early medieval period. And they represent something interesting in terms of their cultural origins. The best of them combine traditions from multiple sources. The interlaced patterns of the Germanic and Scandinavian metalworking tradition, brought to Britain by the Anglo-Saxon settlers, the spiral patterns of the earlier Celtic tradition, the technical innovations of the late Roman metalworking tradition, the Christian iconography that was spreading across the island as the conversion proceeded. All of these elements are mixed and combined and transformed into something that belongs to no single tradition, but is recognizably the product of the particular cultural moment of early medieval Britain. This is art as cultural biography, art that tells the story of where it came from and who made it and what world they lived in the language of form and pattern and material rather than in words. The manuscripts tell the same story in a different medium. The great illuminated manuscripts of the period, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, the Lichfield Gospels, the Durham Gospels, are at once the most Christian and the most un-Roman objects that post-Roman Britain produced. Christian in their content and their purpose, products of communities of monks who were devoting their lives to the service of God as they understood it, but un-Roman, or at least trans-Roman, in their visual language. The carpet pages, those full pages of pure abstract pattern that appear in many of these manuscripts, have no precedent in Roman art. They belong to a tradition that is distinctively British and Irish, that draws on the Celtic past and the Germanic present, and transforms both into something that had never existed before. The opening page of the Gospel of John in the Lindisfarne Gospels is a page that you could look at for a lifetime and still find new things in it. The great initial letters of the opening words, in principio erat verbum, in the beginning was the Word, expand into a world of interlocking spirals and animal forms and geometric patterns and tiny figures that seems to have no limits, that seems to be generating itself endlessly from some inexhaustible source of form. And woven through all of it, almost hidden, almost at the scale of the microscopic, are birds and beasts and fish, tiny creatures of incredible delicacy, caught in the great web of pattern, like flies in amber. The monk who made that page was not just decorating a book. He was making a statement about the nature of creation, about the relationship between order and pattern, and the infinite complexity of the natural world. About the word that was in the beginning, the logos that underlies all things. It is a theological argument made in form and line and colour rather than in words, and it was made in a monastery on a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria by a monk who had been trained in a tradition that drew on Irish and Pictish and Anglo-Saxon and Roman sources simultaneously. It was made in the middle of the 400 years of chaos. It was made by someone who, if you had asked them, would probably have told you that the world they lived in was fallen and corrupt and far inferior to what it had been in the golden age of the early church. But they made it anyway. They made this extraordinary thing anyway. And that is, I think, one of the most important things you can say about the post-Roman period in Britain. People kept making extraordinary things, even in the middle of the chaos. They kept creating beauty, even when the world around them was ugly and violent and uncertain. That is not nothing. That is everything. Let us spend some time now in the landscape of the mind, because the post-Roman period in Britain was also a period of extraordinary intellectual activity, and that activity deserves attention. We have talked about Gilders and Bede and Nennius and the poets of the Welsh tradition. But there were other thinkers in this period, other people who were using the inheritance of the classical world to think about the problems of their own time. One of the most interesting is Pelagius. Pelagius was a British monk, probably from a Celtic background, who travelled to Rome in the late 4th century and became involved in the great theological controversies of the day. And the controversy he became most associated with was one of the most important in the history of Christian thought, the debate over grace and free will. The orthodox position, associated above all with Augustine of Hippo, held that human beings were fundamentally corrupted by original sin and could not achieve salvation through their own efforts. They needed grace, the freely given gift of God's favour, to be saved. And the recipients of that grace were chosen by God before they were born, through a process that was inscrutable to human understanding. This was the doctrine of predestination. Pelagius disagreed. He argued that God would not condemn people for doing something that was beyond their power to avoid. If human beings did not have the genuine ability to choose good over evil, then God would not punish them for choosing evil. Therefore, human beings must have genuine free will. They must be genuinely capable of moral effort. And that moral effort mattered, was not simply swallowed up in the foreordained decrees of an inscrutable divine will. The Pelagian controversy, as it became known, was one of the defining theological debates of the early 5th century. Augustine devoted enormous energy to refuting Pelagius. Church councils condemned the Pelagian position, and Pelagius himself was eventually forced to leave Rome and disappeared from the historical record. His ultimate fate unknown. But Pelagianism did not disappear from Britain. The heresy kept reappearing in the island for generations after the initial controversy. Germanus of Auxerre, a bishop from Gaul, made 2 journeys to Britain in 429 and perhaps again in the 440s, specifically to combat Pelagianism. And the fact that he had to make 2 journeys suggests that the first one had not entirely solved the problem. What is interesting about the persistence of Pelagianism in Britain is what it might tell us about British culture and British ways of thinking in this period. The Pelagian emphasis on human moral effort, on the real capacity of individuals to choose good over evil, on the importance of that choice, resonates with what we know of British culture more broadly. The British traditions of heroic poetry, the emphasis in the Welsh sources on individual excellence and personal virtue, the sense that what matters is how you conduct yourself in the face of adversity. All of this is more congenial to a Pelagian than to an Augustinian worldview. Maybe this is fanciful. Maybe the persistence of Pelagianism in Britain had nothing to do with cultural predispositions and everything to do with the accident of which texts were available and which preachers were influential. But I find it hard not to see, in the British instinct toward Pelagianism, something that connects to the broader story of how Britain coped with the chaos of the post-Roman period. A culture that emphasized individual effort and personal virtue and the real possibility of doing the right thing was well suited to surviving in conditions where the structures that had previously organized moral life had collapsed. Now let us talk about what is happening on the very edge of the world, on the edge that you reach if you sail west from Britain until you can sail no further. The islands of the Atlantic, the places that the Irish monks sailed to in their little boats, looking for isolation and silence and the presence of God. The Orkneys and Shetlands to the north of Scotland, the Faroe Islands further out in the Atlantic, Iceland further still. The Irish monks were among the first Europeans to settle these places, or at least the first whose settlement we know about. They went in search of what they called the desert, by which they meant not the sandy desert of Egypt where the first Christian hermits had gone to pray, but any remote and uninhabited place where you could be alone with God without the distractions of human society. And they found extraordinary places. The island of Skellig Michael off the coast of Kerry, a rock that rises sheer from the Atlantic and that the monks climbed to build their stone beehive cells near the summit. If you have seen it, and many people have seen it in recent years, because it appeared in the Star Wars films, you will understand immediately both why the monks chose it and what it must have been like to live there. It is one of the most dramatic and most beautiful and most inhospitable places in the world, and the monks lived there for centuries. The tradition of the sea voyage as a spiritual practice, the idea that sailing into the unknown was a form of self-offering to God, generated a literature of sea voyages, of which the voyage of Brendan is the most famous. But there were others, tales of monks who sailed off from the Irish coast in boats made of hides stretched over wooden frames, coracles or curras, without any particular destination, trusting themselves to God and the wind. Some of them died. Some of them found islands and built cells and lived out their lives in prayer and contemplation. And some of them perhaps found things that we would not expect. The saga literature of Iceland, written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, but drawing on older traditions, contains references to Irish monks, whom the Norse sagas call papa, who were already in Iceland when the first Norse settlers arrived in the late 9th century. The monks apparently left when the Norse came, not wanting to live with pagans, but traces of their presence remained in the names of some of the places they had inhabited. If the Irish monks were in Iceland by the late 9th century, how far had they thus gone before that? The Faroes were certainly reached. Iceland almost certainly. And beyond Iceland, the sagas also mention a land called Havitra the land of the white men, which some scholars have interpreted as a reference to a country beyond Iceland, where people who were Irish in origin or appearance had established themselves. Was this Greenland? Was it North America? We do not know. We probably will never know for certain. The evidence is too fragmentary, too ambiguous. But the question sits there, tantalizing. In the century before the Vikings reached Iceland, before Leif Erikson sailed to Vinland, were Irish monks already somewhere in the Western Atlantic? Were they these extraordinary men who deliberately pushed the limits of the known world in pursuit of their God, the first Europeans to cross the Atlantic? It is a question that belongs to the spirit of the post-Roman period, a spirit of adventure and boundary crossing and willingness to go into the unknown that is one of the most remarkable features of the Celtic Christian tradition. The Irish monks were not content with the known world. They wanted to know what was beyond it. And in wanting that, in acting on that desire, they were doing something that connects them, across all the centuries and all the differences, to the human impulse of exploration and discovery that has driven our species from the beginning. Let us come back to Britain now. Let us come back to England in the late 8th century, just before the Vikings arrive and change everything. What does England look like at this moment? It is a landscape of kingdoms. Northumbria in the north, running from the Humber to the Firth of Forth and westward to the Pennines. Mercia in the Midlands, the most powerful of the southern kingdoms at this period, stretching from the Thames Valley northward and eastward across what is now the East Midlands. East Anglia on the eastern coast, the kingdoms of the southeast, Kent and Sussex and Essex, smaller and increasingly in the orbit of Mercia, and Wessex in the south and southwest, the kingdom that will eventually outlast all the others and become the core around which a unified English kingdom will be built. These kingdoms are in many ways recognizably English in a way that would be recognizable to someone from the later medieval period, even if the political structures are different. The landscape has been settled and farmed in ways that are becoming increasingly similar to the medieval pattern. The Church has established its organization of parishes and dioceses across the country. The law is being written down in Old English, creating a tradition of vernacular legal writing that is unusual in Europe at this time. And the culture is rich. The monastic scriptoriums are producing manuscripts. The courts of the great kings are patronizing art and scholarship. The tradition of Old English poetry, which will eventually produce Beowulf, is thriving in the halls of the nobility. But there is fragmentation. There is constant competition among the kingdoms. There is warfare. There is the persistent pressure of the Welsh and Scottish borders. And there is, just about to happen, the arrival of the Vikings. The Vikings changed Britain as fundamentally as the Anglo-Saxons had changed it 3 centuries earlier. They raided first, as we have seen. Then they settled. The great army that arrived in England in 865, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Mysil here, the great heathen army was not a raiding party looking for plunder and a quick return. It was a force of conquest and settlement. It took York in 866 and made it the centre of a Norse kingdom in the north. It pushed into East Anglia and killed its king, Edmund, who was later venerated as a saint and martyr. It threatened Mercia and forced the Mercian king to make peace through tribute. And then it turned toward Wessex. And here is where the story of post-Roman Britain connects to a story that is much better known. Because Wessex did not fall. Wessex, under a king who was nearly captured and who spent desperate months as a fugitive hiding in the Somerset marshes, survived. And that king, who eventually rallied his forces, defeated the great army in a decisive battle at Edington in 878 and negotiated a settlement that divided England between the Anglo-Saxon south and west and the Norse north and east, was Alfred. Alfred the Great, the only English monarch to whom the epithet great has been attached by later generations. A man who was not just a military leader, but a scholar, a translator, a lawgiver, a visionary, a man who saw, with unusual clarity, that the survival of English culture depended not just on military victory over the Vikings, but on the revitalization of English learning and English identity. Alfred reformed the church. He brought scholars from Wales and the continent to his court. He translated Latin texts into Old English, including the pastoral care of Pope Gregory, specifically so that people who could not read Latin could access important Christian teaching. He organized the defense of Wessex by creating a system of fortified towns, burhs, that could provide refuge and resistance against Viking attack. He reorganized the English military system to make it more effective. He commissioned, or at least initiated, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the systematic record of English history in Old English that was continued for generations after his death, and that is one of our most important sources for the history of the period. Alfred is the man who saved England. That is the traditional claim. And it is not entirely wrong. Without Alfred's resistance in the 870s and 880s, the whole of England might have been absorbed into a Norse world, with consequences for language and culture and identity that are difficult to imagine. English, as a language and as an identity, might not have survived. But Alfred is also something else. He is the culmination of a process, the end result of the 400 years of chaos that we have been exploring. He is what post-Roman Britain eventually produced. He is the point at which the threads we have been following, the Roman inheritance, the Christian tradition, the Old English linguistic and cultural tradition, the Brittonic connection preserved in the Welsh texts he translated, and the Welsh scholars he employed, all of these come together in a single individual who is conscious of all of them and who is trying, deliberately and intelligently, to weave them into a coherent vision of English identity and English destiny. Alfred is post-Roman Britain arriving at a moment of self-consciousness, looking back at what has been lost and what has been preserved, and looking forward to what might be built from what has survived. He did not complete the job. That was left to his son, Edward, and his grandson, Athelstan, who in 927 became the first king to rule a genuinely unified English kingdom. But Alfred started it, and what he started grew out of everything that had come before, out of all the chaos and the loss and the resilience and the creativity of the 4 centuries that followed the Roman withdrawal. That is the shape of the story. From the moment of rupture, when the Roman connection snapped in the early 5th century, to the moment of reunion, when the fragmented landscape of post-Roman Britain began to cohere into something new. 4 centuries of chaos, and at the end of it, not a return to what had been, because what had been was gone and could not return, but something else, something that the chaos had made. England, Wales, Scotland, in process of formation in the north. Ireland, transformed by Patrick and the monastic tradition into something the pre-Christian Ireland could never have imagined. And beyond the island, across the Channel in Brittany, a piece of Britain that had migrated to the continent and maintained its Brittonic identity there for centuries. All of this is what the departure of the Romans set in motion. Not immediately, not directly, but through the long and complicated and violent and creative process of transformation that we have been following tonight. Now, there is one more dimension of this story that we have not yet fully explored, the dimension of memory, of how the people of post-Roman Britain remembered the Roman period and what they did with those memories. Memory is a strange thing. It is selective, it simplifies and distorts. It attaches emotional value to some things and strips it from others. And over time, across generations, individual memories become collective memories, and collective memories become myths. The memory of Rome in post-Roman Britain went through exactly this process. In the immediate aftermath of the Roman withdrawal, people who had lived in Roman Britain had direct personal memories of the world that had been. They remembered the cities and the roads and the markets and the baths. They remembered the soldiers and the administrators and the merchants. They remembered what it had been like to live in a province of the Roman Empire. Those memories were of a vanished world, and they carried with them an emotional charge that is easy to recognize. The charge of loss. The sense that something valuable had been taken away, something that could not be recovered. Gildas, writing in the mid-6th century, is saturated with this sense of loss. He describes Roman Britain not as the provincial backwater that it might look like from a modern perspective, but as a golden age, a time of prosperity and order and justice, compared with which his own world is a place of chaos and sin. This is not an objective historical assessment. It is a memory transformed by the process of transmission and by the emotional needs of the people doing the transmitting. Gildas's Rome is as much a moral ideal as a historical reality, but it is a powerful ideal, one that served important purposes for the communities that kept it alive. The memory of Rome as a golden age that had been lost and that might, under the right conditions, be recovered, was one of the organizing myths of early medieval Britain. It was connected to the memory of Roman Christianity, to the idea that the island had once been a properly Christian place, governed by properly Christian rulers, and that the chaos of the present was a punishment for the sins that had led to the loss of that Christian order. It was connected to the memory of Roman law, to the idea that there had once been a time when disputes were settled by proper legal process rather than by force. And it was connected to the memory of Roman literacy, to the sense that knowledge and learning had once been more widespread, more accessible, more systematically organized than they were now. These memories shaped how people in post-Roman Britain thought about their predicament and about what they needed to do. They generated aspirations, the aspiration to recover the Christian order, the aspiration to establish just and effective governance, the aspiration to preserve and transmit learning. And those aspirations, however incompletely realized in any given case, drove the creation of the monasteries, the development of the early medieval kingdoms, the production of the manuscripts and the legal codes and the vernacular literature that are the chief cultural legacy of the period. Memory is not just passive, it is active. It shapes the future, as well as preserving the past. And the memory of something else was active in post-Roman Britain as well. The memory, or more precisely, the myth of a period before Rome, of the Iron Age Britons who had lived in the island before the Roman conquest, who had maintained their own culture and their own traditions through the Roman period, and who were still there after Rome was gone. The memory of this people, of their culture and their language and their ways, was preserved most fully in Wales. And in Wales, in the centuries after the Roman withdrawal, it was being actively elaborated, transformed into a mythology of origins, of how the Britons came to be the people they were. The Historia Britonum of Nennius, whatever its historical unreliability, is a monument to this mythologizing of origins. It traces the Britons back to a Trojan refugee named Brutus, grandson of the Trojan hero Aeneas, who led his people to the island that would take his name. Britain from Brutus. This is the kind of myth that serious historians reject, and that nonetheless tells you something important about the people who created it. The Britons wanted to be descended from Troy, from the same epic lineage as the Romans themselves, because if they were, then they were not simply the conquered provincials of a foreign empire. They were the equals of Rome, the heirs of the same ancient tradition. This is the mythological argument for why the Britons had as much right to their island as the Anglo-Saxons, as much claim to be its legitimate inhabitants. It was an argument that mattered in a world where such claims were constantly being contested by force. And over the Trojan origin myth, over the memory of Rome, over the poetry of the heroic age, the figure of Arthur presided. Arthur, who was British, not Roman, and not Anglo-Saxon. Arthur, who had ruled in the island and who had beaten the invaders, and who had, according to the tradition that grew up around him, not died, but only withdrawn, sleeping somewhere in a cave or under a hill, waiting to return when Britain needed him again. The myth of the sleeping king, the Rex quondam rexque futurus, the once and future king, is one of the most powerful and most persistent myths in the Western tradition. It appears in connection with Arthur, most famously, but it also appears in connection with Charlemagne and Frederick Barbarossa, and, in Wales, in connection with Owen of the Red Hand, a medieval Welsh prince who is said to sleep in a cave in Snowdonia, waiting to wake and free his people. This myth says something profound about the experience of post-Roman Britain. It says that the ideal of good governance, the ideal of a just ruler who protects his people and establishes order and defeats the forces of chaos, is not dead. It has only withdrawn. It is waiting, and it will return. That is the hope that sustained the Brittonic peoples through the worst of the post-Roman period, and it is the hope that found its most powerful expression in the legend of Arthur. We have travelled a long way tonight, From the moment the Roman legions left, through the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries, through the extraordinary cultural flowering of the 7th and 8th centuries, to the threshold of the Viking Age, we have met kings and monks and poets and merchants and healers. We have visited great ruins and tiny islands. We have explored the linguistic transformation of the island and the religious transformation and the artistic transformation. And we have tried, throughout, to keep sight of the human dimension, of what all of this meant to the people who lived through it. What does it all add up to? What is the meaning of the 400 years of chaos? I think the meaning is something like this. Human civilization is not a fixed thing. It is a process, a continuous process of creation and destruction and recreation. The civilization of Roman Britain was not the first civilization in the island, and it was not the last. It came, it transformed what it found, and it left. And what it left behind, the ruins and the roads and the language and the law and the religion and the memory, became the raw material out of which something new was built. The people who built that new thing did not choose their circumstances. They did not choose to be born into the chaos of post-Roman Britain. They did not choose the violence and the uncertainty and the loss. But they chose, within the constraints of their circumstances, how to respond. And the choices they made, cumulatively, over generations, were the choices that made Britain what it eventually became. Those choices were not always good. There was cruelty and exploitation and injustice in post-Roman Britain, as there is in every human society, in every period of history. The strong preyed on the weak. The clever deceived the simple. The powerful ignored the needs of the powerless. Nothing we have been talking about tonight should be romanticized into a golden age any more than the Roman period itself should be. But there was also courage and creativity, and the stubborn persistence of communities in maintaining what they valued, in passing on what they believed was worth passing on, in keeping alive, through the worst of the chaos, the threads of language and culture and story that would eventually weave into something that endured. 400 years, a long time to endure, and yet here we are, speaking English, which grew out of the language of the Anglo-Saxon settlers of the 5th and 6th centuries, telling stories of Arthur, which grew out of the desperate mythology of the Brittonic peoples fighting for survival, singing Welsh, which grew out of the language spoken in the island before Rome ever came, practicing a form of Christianity that was shaped in ways too deep to fully trace by the Irish missionary tradition that came out of Patrick's vision on a cold Irish hillside 1500 years ago. All of this is the legacy of the chaos. All of this grew out of the 400 years that most people have never heard of. And it is worth knowing about. It is worth remembering. Because in those 400 years, in all their violence and their sorrow and their extraordinary creativity, we can see something of what human beings are capable of. Something about the depth of human resilience. Something about the capacity of communities to maintain their identity and their values even when the world is ending around them. Something about what it means to endure. We are, all of us, the descendants of people who endured things we can barely imagine. People who lost everything and rebuilt from nothing. People who kept singing and making art and writing poetry and copying manuscripts and sailing into the unknown and arguing about theology and telling stories around fires in the dark. They did not know we were coming. They did not know that what they were doing would matter. They just did it because it was what humans do. Because we are, at our deepest level, the animals who make meaning, the animals who tell stories, the animals who, when the darkness comes, light a fire and gather around it and begin. The Romans left Britain sometime in the early 5th century. The darkness came. And the darkness was very dark indeed. But it was not the end. It never is. Sleep well. And if you find yourself wondering, as you drift toward the edge of consciousness, what your ancestors were doing on this island 1500 years ago, in the dark time between one world and the next? The answer is, they were doing what you are doing now. They were enduring. They were surviving. They were keeping the fire alive. They were waiting for morning. And morning came. And there is one last thing worth saying, because no story about Britain and Rome and the long darkness that followed should end without acknowledging something that often goes unsaid. The chaos was not evenly distributed. It never is. The people who suffered most in the post-Roman period were not the kings whose names we remember, or the saints whose lives were written down by admiring successors. They were the people at the bottom of every hierarchy. The slaves, and there were slaves in post-Roman Britain, taken in raids and sold and worked until they were no longer useful and then discarded. The women whose lives were circumscribed by the violence and the expectations of a world in which physical force was the ultimate arbiter. The sick and the old and the very young, who were most vulnerable to the famines and the epidemics and the simple brutality of a world without adequate social protection. We do not hear their voices. The record does not preserve them. But they were there. They are always there in every period of history, carrying the weight of the great historical changes on backs that were already bent by the ordinary weight of lives lived near the margin. And they endured, too. They sweated the floors and raised the children and kept the animals alive through the winter. They are in the ground beneath our feet, their bones mingled with the bones of the Roman soldiers and the Anglo-Saxon warriors and the Irish monks. They are in our blood, these nameless people, these ordinary people who made the extraordinary history possible by the simple act of surviving. We owe them something, not a debt we can repay, but at least an acknowledgement, at least the recognition that they were there, that they mattered, that their endurance was the foundation on which everything else was built. They are the deepest continuity of all, the continuity of ordinary human life, going on regardless, through empires and their ends, through chaos and recovery, through the long dark and the returning light. They were always there. They are always here. But let us not leave things there. Let us not end on the edge of sleep without going back one final time to the archaeology. Because the archaeology, the physical evidence that people left behind in the ground, has things to say that the written sources cannot say, and some of those things are among the most moving aspects of the entire story. In various places across Britain, archaeologists working on sites from the post-Roman period have found something that they did not initially know how to interpret. In the ruins of Roman buildings, in the floors of what had been great townhouses and civic structures, they found floors that had been swept, floors that had been maintained, in buildings whose roofs were falling in, whose walls were crumbling, whose grandeur was obviously a thing of the past. Someone had swept the floor. That detail, that tiny, humble, domestic detail. Someone sweeping the floor of a building that was falling down around them. What does it mean? It could mean many things. It could mean that the building was still being used, however reduced its function. It could mean that the person who swept it still felt an obligation to maintain the space, even when maintaining it in any larger sense was beyond their means. It could mean that the sweeping was itself a kind of statement, a refusal to give up entirely, a small act of resistance against the encroaching disorder. Or it could just mean that somebody swept the floor, that the mundane routines of domestic life continued even in the ruins of empire, that people went on doing the things they had always done because those were the things they knew how to do, and because stopping doing them would have been a different kind of defeat. There is a philosopher's thought experiment that I keep coming back to when I think about the post-Roman period in Britain. The thought experiment asks, if you are adrift at sea and you have enough wood to build a raft, or to keep a fire going but not both, which do you choose? The raft represents the means of escape, of moving toward something better. The fire represents warmth and light and the immediate conditions of survival. Which is more important, the people of post-Roman Britain were, in a real sense, adrift in this way. They were in a situation that offered no easy solutions, no clear path back to the world that had been, no obvious path forward to a world that would be better. They were in the middle, in the chaos, with only what they had inherited and what they could create themselves. And what they chose, as a society, as a collection of communities across the island, was not always the most rational, or the most efficient, or the most strategically optimal choice. Sometimes they swept floors when they should have been building rafts. Sometimes they preserved traditions that were already dying. Sometimes they fought battles that could not be won. Sometimes they built monasteries in places where monasteries were wildly impractical, but they also built real things that lasted, the monasteries that preserved learning, the vernacular legal codes that established a framework for governance, the political entities that would eventually become the nations of Britain, the artistic tradition that produced works of beauty we still prize today, the linguistic traditions that are still alive in Wales and in the Old English ancestry of modern English. They built things that lasted because they cared about building them, because they believed, in whatever terms made sense to them, that what they were building was worth building, that the effort was worth making, that the future mattered enough to sacrifice the present for it. That is the lesson of the post-Roman period, if there is one. Not that chaos always resolves into order, not that loss is always followed by recovery, but that the things worth having, the things worth preserving and creating and passing on, require the kind of sustained effort and commitment that refuses to be defeated by circumstance. The floor sweepers of post-Roman Britain, the manuscript copiers of Iona and Lindisfarne, the poets who kept the Welsh language alive in the courts of the Welsh kings, the monks who sailed into the Atlantic, the craftsmen who made the Sutton Hoo helmet, the warriors who rode south to their deaths, and the poet who survived to remember them. All of them were, in their different ways, doing the same thing. They were refusing to give up. They were insisting that something they valued was worth preserving. They were sweeping the floor. And because they did, because generation after generation of them did, the floor was there to be swept by the generation that came after. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. The island that the Romans left in the early 5th century was not the island they found in the 1st century. They had changed it profoundly, for better and for worse. And the island that emerged from the 400 years of chaos was not the island that Rome had made. The chaos had changed it, destroyed much of what Rome had built, and in the process of destruction had created something new. That is how history works. Not cleanly, not efficiently, not in ways that anyone would have designed if they had been given the choice, but effectively. The great cycles of creation and destruction that are the rhythm of human civilization turn out, when you look at them from far enough away, to have a direction, not always upward, not always towards something better, but always towards something different, always towards something that could not have been predicted from what came before. The Britain that came out of the post-Roman chaos could not have been predicted from the Britain that went in. The Welsh language, which would not exist without the Roman period and would not have survived without the chaos that followed it. The English language, which could not have developed without the Anglo-Saxon settlers who came in the wake of the Roman withdrawal. The Irish Christian tradition, which grew out of a slave boy's experience of captivity and his subsequent vision of a calling that he could not resist. None of this was planned. None of it was inevitable. All of it was contingent, the result of thousands of individual decisions made by people who did not know what the consequences of their decisions would be. And that is, in the end, the deepest lesson of the post-Roman period. The future is made by the choices of individuals in conditions they did not choose, for purposes they can only partly see, with consequences they cannot predict. The chaos was not the enemy of the future. The chaos was the crucible in which the future was made. The Romans left Britain sometime in the early 5th century. They left behind roads and ruins, and a language and a religion and a memory. And the people they left behind took all of those things and all of their own things, the things that had been in the island before Rome ever arrived, and they made something new out of all of it. Something that took 400 years to make. Something that was forged in chaos and violence and loss and extraordinary creativity and the stubborn, persistent, unreasonable refusal of human beings to give up on the things they love. That thing is Britain. Complicated, contested, still in process, still being made, but real. As real as the roads the Romans laid and the words the Britons spoke, and the gold the Anglo-Saxon craftsmen worked, and the prayers the Irish monks sang on their storm-lashed islands at the edge of the world. Real and enduring and worth knowing about. The fire burns low now. The story draws toward its end. Outside, whatever darkness or light greets you. The world continues, as it has always continued, indifferent to the small dramas of our individual lives, but shaped in its deepest features by the accumulated choices of all the generations that have come before. The road that the Romans laid runs under the modern motorway. The church that the monks built stands on the hill above the town. The language that the Anglo-Saxons brought and the Welsh preserved is in your mouth, shaping your thoughts. Even now, you are the inheritance of all of this, of the chaos and the endurance and the creativity, of the floor sweeping and the manuscript copying and the sea voyaging, of the battles lost and the battles won and the battles that nobody won but everybody survived. You are what they made, and you are still in the process of being made. That is the story of what happened when the Romans left Britain. Not the end of the world, just the end of a world and the beginning of another. If this journey through the dark centuries has kept you company tonight, if it has given your mind something to wander through on the way toward sleep, then I'm glad. Leave a comment if you are still awake enough to do it. Tell me where in the world you are lying in the dark. What time is it there? What the weather is doing outside your window? These small connections, across distance and time and the strange medium of this strange technology we use to tell each other stories, are their own kind of continuity, their own tiny refusal to let the dark be simply dark. Sleep well. The morning is coming.